Chapter 128. Wow, there are a lot of things here. Looking at the animals stored in the tents around him, Jiang Hai said with some surprise. Of course, young man. But this is only a grazing exhibition in Massachusetts. If it's in the East or even the whole country, it would be even bigger. Hearing his words, a person brushing a horse's mane in a nearby booth also smiled and said, Haha. Hearing the other party's words, Jiang Hai nodded kindly and continued to stroll around here. Is this your first time attending a grazing exhibition like this? Looking at Jiang Hai's curious gaze, Shinty Clive, who followed him in, also followed behind him with a smile on her face. Well, yes. Hearing her words, Jiang Hai didn't think too much and answered directly. Now his eyes are a little short. Although this grazing exhibition is only in Massachusetts, the scale is a little beyond his expectations. In the past, he had only heard of grazing exhibitions, but this was the first time he had seen one with his own eyes. He had originally thought that grazing exhibitions that covered an entire state would probably only have a dozen or so booths, or maybe even 20 booths. After all, Massachusetts itself was a small state. It's a small state that is difficult to see clearly on the map of the United States. But when he came here, he realized that he was a little too naive. The entire venue covers an area of about 4 square kilometers, which is 2 kilometers horizontally and 2 kilometers vertically. Just like the Chinese character Tian, it is divided into 4 areas, namely the Cattle Exhibition Hall, the Horse Exhibition Hall, the Sheep Exhibition Hall, and the Supporting Exhibition Hall. Jiang Hai entered the Horse Exhibition Hall. As soon as he walked in, he found that there were at least 30 or 40 individual exhibition halls. Of course, this was not a game exhibition or a food price exhibition. Those exhibitions were held indoors, and models were invited. However, this exhibition was outdoors. Although it was called an individual exhibition hall, it was actually a separate stable. Many horses were kept in the stable for people to choose. Of course, there were also some that were not for sale, such as the horse of the man who talked to Jiang Hai just now. It was a very good horse, a pure white purebred horse. In England, it was used as a horse for the royal guards. The bloodline certificate hanging next to it was quite complete, and it had even participated in a dressage competition. The front of the stable was connected to a TV, which showed the horse's performance during the competition. If such a horse was sold in its prime, it would not be rare for it to be sold for millions of dollars. But it was obvious that the man wouldn't kill the goose that laid the golden eggs. He was mainly selling the offspring of this horse. He would find another pure-blooded horse and breed the offspring to be 1-year-old ponies. If the offspring were in good condition, they could be sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars. Even if the offspring weren't in good condition, they could still be sold for tens of thousands of dollars. They were much more expensive than regular horses. Jiang Hai didn't know much about horses. He was only here to watch the fun. After all, his family's Xia was still in a state of free range. There was no other way. After buying the horse, he didn't have time to domesticate it. In his opinion, riding a horse wasn't an easy thing to do. It needed to be learned alone. Back then, Luo Binci and the others were very busy, so he didn't have the heart to learn. But now, looking at these horses, he had the urge to go back and ride them. Of course, even if he wanted to ride them, he would not ride them now. Jiang Hai planned to wait until spring came and the flowers bloomed. Then he would learn to ride a horse. Jiang Hai believed that with the horse he had fed for so long in his blood, if he wanted to ride a horse, this guy should not resist. While thinking, Jiang Hai and Shinty Clive walked out of the stable. Although Jiang Hai was very curious about Mu Mu Zhan, he was mainly curious about the cow. Compared to a cowboy, a horse was naturally a very good thing. But for Jiang Hai, a horse, to put it bluntly, was just a means of transportation. He was not a professional cowboy, so he was not very interested in horses. The most important thing was that the horses here were really not cheap. Walking with Sandy along the way, they walked past the stable and entered the largest and most crowded market next to it, the Cattle Exhibition Hall. As soon as they walked in, the smell of cattle rushed into Jiang Hai's nose. Even Sandy couldn't help but cover her nose with her hand, let alone Jiang Hai. Cough cough, it's so choking. Turning his head, Jiang Hai was choked by the smell. He couldn't help but frown and said carefully, although the smell here was not as strong as his own cattle shed, it was definitely not bad. Hee, you are a manor owner. You can't even stand the smell of cattle. Looking at Jiang Hai's appearance, Sandy next to him smiled and took out a handkerchief from her small bag and handed it to Jiang Hai. Jiang Hai immediately took the handkerchief and covered his nose. Only then did he breathe a sigh of relief. The handkerchief was very fragrant. Jiang Hai also knew that this was a man-made fragrance. It was not good for the human body, but smelling this smell was better than smelling cattle farts. So I almost never enter our cattle shed. Even if I go in, I have to wear a mask. After taking a deep breath, Jiang Hai finally calmed down. Then he looked at the smiling Shinty Clive and shrugged. You still need to adapt early. Although Uncle Robbins is a good person, it is your own business after all. You have to know what to do. Hearing Jiang Hai's words, Shinty Clive said with a chuckle, of course. By the way, did you know? Some people say that the main reason for global warming is that cows fart too much. The farts of a few cows in a year are almost as much as the exhaust of a car. After hearing Shinty Clive's words, Jiang Hai smiled a little embarrassedly. He was a little embarrassed to be criticized by a beautiful woman, so he changed the topic. However, the change of topic was not ordinary. Ahihi. Shinty Clive didn't know how to respond to Jiang Hai's words. Should he talk about cattle farts? Stop joking. Fortunately, Shinty Clive knew Jiang Hai's personality, so he didn't care. To put it bluntly, Jiang Hai's personality was still a little chinibu. At least, he didn't show that he had a superior EQ. It seemed that although the true dragon soul essence could strengthen his physique and memory, it didn't change his EQ. Seeing that Shinty Clive wasn't interested in talking about cattle farts, Jiang Hai didn't have much interest in talking about it. Jiang Hai also curled his lips. He didn't feel that there was anything wrong with saying such things at this time, but it was a pity that he couldn't show off his knowledge. Then he covered his nose and walked into the cattle exhibition hall. When he first walked in, the smell was really choking, but after a short while, it was much better. The cattle exhibition hall was much more lively than the horse exhibition hall. There were more than 100 booths, but most of the booths were for private farms. There were only a few cows in total, but there were all kinds of different styles. In addition to the Angus cattle that Jiang Hai was very familiar with, there were many other types of beef cattle. There were Piedmont, Limousin, Simmenthal, Charolais, Hayford, and so on. In addition to beef cattle, there were also dairy cows and draft cattle. Although cattle were no longer used for farming in the United States, some people were still willing to collect draft cattle. Therefore, the cattle here were really diverse. Looking at the cattle in front of him, Jiang Hai also chatted with SH-20 Clive. While looking at the variety of cattle in front of him, suddenly, a cow entered his eyes. Yes, it was a cow, not a herd. This was because there was only one cow in the exhibition hall. This exhibition hall was definitely not small, and it wouldn't be a problem to hold a dozen cows. But at this time there was only one cow. But even so, this cow shed looked a lot more pocket-sized. Looking at the cow, Jiang Hai slowly walked over. This cow was very big and very tall, even taller than Jiang Hai. Its body length was also much longer than an ordinary cow. Jiang Hai looked at it and saw that it was about 3 meters tall. Its entire body was covered in thick fur, and there was a pair of small horns on its head. Although the horns were not big for its size, they were unusually sharp. Its pair of eyes stared warily at everyone, looking here and there. Is this American bison? Seeing this huge guy, Jiang Hai was stunned for a moment. Then he asked SH-20 Clive suspiciously, because he seemed to have seen this guy in the zoo before. It was obviously not an ordinary domestic cow, so it must be a bison. It seems to be. SH-20 Clive didn't specialize in cattle, but she was a primary school teacher. She led the children to the zoo, so naturally she needed to explain. Looking at the cow in front of her, she was also a little uncertain. You guys really have good taste. This is indeed an American bison, but it's not wild. The wild ones are all in Yellowstone Park. This one is an experimental animal that our school has raised privately. This time, we came to the exhibition mainly to raise funds to domesticate this kind of bison. Just when Jiang Hai and Sh20 Clive were a little uncertain, a young man walked over from the side. Compared to the other people in the exhibition hall, who were either in suits or jeans, this person's clothes were much more ordinary. It was just a down jacket with a school emblem on his chest. Jiang Hai didn't know what the emblem represented, but Sh20 Clive did. Hearing this person's words, she took the initiative to nod. Are you students from B City University? Sh20 Clive looked at the person in front of her and asked curiously. Oh yes, we are in ecology and evolution. Our research topic is the large-scale domestication of wild animals. Hearing Xanthi's words, the student immediately smiled and answered. It was an honor to answer a beauty's question. Chapter 129. Boston University, or BU for short, was founded in 1839. Most people's first impression of it would be that it was a public university, but that was not the case. It was actually a private university, and it was one of the top private universities in the world. It was also the third largest private university in the United States. It had a high academic reputation in the world, and it had always been in the top 100 in the world and the top 50 in North America. It was ranked 32nd in the world. It had produced 6 Nobel Prize winners and 22 Pulitzer Prize winners. The most famous alumnus was probably Martin Luther King, who loved to dream. Don't think that just because this university had produced so many Pulitzer Prize winners, it was just a journalism university. In fact, journalism wasn't a very important subject in this university. The subjects they were most proficient in were business, engineering, economics, and biomedical engineering. This subject could even be ranked in the top 10 in the United States. In the evaluation, ecology, evolution, and systems biology were ranked 6th in the United States. Of course, this had nothing to do with Jiang Hai. He did not have any interest in studying. However, he was very interested in this research because he knew that even domesticated beef cattle could not be compared to wild cattle. Firstly, there was a huge difference in weight. The heaviest bison in the United States could reach a ton. This was something that domestic beef cattle couldn't compare to. Secondly, this type of bison, even if it was domesticated, was still a bison. It was just like the wild boar in China. Even if it was domesticated, it was still a wild boar. Selling it would be expensive. Perhaps the price might not be high in the United States, but if it was sold in China, it would be very expensive. Once he said that it was wild beef, the already high price would at least double. At this time, Xanthi Clive was already a little tired. Compared to Jiang Hai, it was obvious that the big boy opposite him was more speechless. It was true that she was a teacher, but it did not mean that a teacher would like academic questions. Although she was not like those vain girls, who would open their mouths to talk about branded clothes, good makeup products, jewelry, shoes, and so on, she was willing to listen to some romantic topics. Jiang Hai's bullsh *T was already cold enough. But this young man spoke even more coldly. What DNA, what helix, what chromosomal pairs, what XY? She listened to him in confusion, but this young man clearly talked about the field that he was best at, and there was no end to it. It would be rude to just walk away, so she hesitated for a while and decided to follow Jiang Hai. However, when she saw that Jiang Hai was looking at the cow, she deliberately walked over. Seeing that the goddess in front of them had only said a few words, and then returned to the yellow man's side, the students here couldn't help but be a little speechless. There was no other way. People like them who engaged in research were also a kind of otaku. Obviously, they were not very good at observing women. Although Jiang Hai had such a character, at least he was more familiar with Xanthi Clive. Hey, isn't this the great manor owner? What's wrong? Are you interested in this cow? Unfortunately, it's not for sale. Just as the big boy did not know what to say, a few figures walked over from a distance. The person leading them was the guy Jiang Hai had seen in the restaurant today. He was from the Carlight Company. Beside him, in addition to the few people they met at noon, there were a few people wearing the same clothes as the boy in front of Jiang Hai. From the school badge on their chest, it could be seen that they were all from B City University. Our company invested in the development of this cow. In other words, this cow belongs to our company. Look at the surrounding cow sheets. 80% of them belong to our company. Unfortunately, there is no place for you here. What's the matter? You're so old that you can't sell it? Looking at Jiang Hai, the man said with a sour face. What a pity. Although the cows here belong to your company, they don't seem to belong to you. His cows all belong to him. Are you standing here and talking like this because you envy him? Hearing his words, Jiang Hai didn't have time to speak, but Cindy Clive, who was beside him, had already stood up, a trace of anger flashing across her face. From her point of view, this fellow had come to find fault with them, and it was somewhat baffling. Jiang Hai didn't even know him, but he kept coming here to make his presence known. His words were so sour. Who was he trying to convince? After being insulted by Jiang Hai, he still came here to show off. She really didn't know where his sense of superiority came from. In terms of size, he wasn't as good as Jiang Hai, and in terms of money, he was even worse. Jiang Hai had a manor worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And this guy was just a worker, so why was he showing off here? Even SH-20 Clive couldn't stand it anymore. She walked to the front and said to the man, I envy him? What do I envy him for? He's just a country bumpkin. Hearing Xanthi's words, the man couldn't help but be speechless for a while. After he finished speaking, he whispered something in a low voice. But this sentence was heard by Jiang Hai. Jiang Hai was a pure Northeastern man. Northeastern men were particular about fighting, not quarreling. This guy's words were originally sour, which made Jiang Hai a little unhappy. And now, this guy actually dared to talk about him in front of his face. How could he endure it? Jiang Hai's temper wasn't very good, so he took a big stride and directly arrived in front of this person. In front of everyone's eyes, Jiang Hai grabbed this guy's collar and directly lifted him up. Feeling the strength of Jiang Hai's steel-like arm, this guy was somewhat stunned. He grabbed Jiang Hai's arm with one hand while his other hand was constantly waving in the air. What are you doing? Put me down, security, security. Hearing his exclamation, several security guards, who were watching in the distance, quickly ran over at this time. As for the researchers and students around him, they were a little confused. It was not an exaggeration to say that these students were straight-A students. However, straight-A students were more focused on their studies and not on fighting. When they saw such a thing, they could not wait to avoid it. How could they go forward? He called me a country bumpkin, I heard it. Can I sue him? Jiang Hai looked at the guy who kept struggling in his hand, sneered, then turned his head and said to SH-20 Clive, It seems that you can't. But if you teach him a lesson, you probably only need to pay some medical expenses. Hearing Jiang Hai's words, Xanthi also smiled and said slowly, but although she said that, she winked at Jiang Hai. Oh, I see. It's a pity that I lack everything but money. Staring at the person in front of him, Jiang Hai sighed. In the United States, where everything can be related to race, it's not illegal to call someone a country bumpkin. Jiang Hai really felt that he was a dog. But to teach a lesson to this snobbish guy, it wasn't as simple as what Sandy said. What she said was more for this guy to hear. She winked at Jiang Hai, telling him that if Jiang Hai really hit him, then it might not be as simple as what she said. Jiang Hai didn't think that Sandy would be able to teach him a lesson. After all, Jiang Hai just got his green card. If he gets involved in any violent conflict, it won't be good for Jiang Hai. Sir, please calm down. Let go of the person in your hand, otherwise we will call the police. At this time, the security guards over there also quickly ran over, but they didn't dare to act rashly. The security guards in the United States believe that work is work, life is life. Work is only for making money, and it's not worth it to lose your life for money. So after these people surrounded Jiang Hai, they didn't say much, they just persuaded Jiang Hai to let go. Boring. Looking at the security guards around him, Jiang Hai curled his lips. He originally thought that these guys would directly rush over. Now it seems that these guys have no guts, but he didn't want to make a big deal out of it. He directly let go of the man and pushed him away. The man was in mid-air, so where could he borrow strength from? He was directly pushed to the ground by Jiang Hai, falling heavily on his butt. You barbarian, you country bumpkin, I want to sue you. Feeling the pain in his butt, the most important thing is that he lost all his face this time. At this time, the man couldn't help but jump up, covering his painful butt with one hand, and shouted while jumping. Whatever. Jiang Hai just pushed him like this. It's not even a slight injury. The police won't care about it. You are a barbarian. You are a butcher, you yellow. Cough. As long as I am still in the company, you can't sell a cow. Don't think about it. Seeing Jiang Hai's indifferent look, the guy couldn't help but curse. But halfway through, he just came out with the word, Yilu. And he stopped in time because he remembered that this guy just asked the beautiful woman beside him if what he said was racial discrimination. Originally, country bumpkin didn't count, but if he finished this sentence, then it would count. At the same time, he also saw the coldness in Jiang Hai's eyes, which made him stop his words in time and attack Jiang Hai's cow. In his opinion, Jiang Hai's cow is good, but it is destined that this cow can't be sold after offending him. Hearing his words, Jiang Hai's mouth couldn't help but twitch. Can't sell? That's if it's of the same quality as this guy's cow. It can't be sold. But is Jiang Hai's cow of the same quality as him? Don't joke, Jiang Hai's cow. Just looking at the meat, even the Japanese Wagyu cattle may not be comparable to him, let alone these free-range cows in the United States. Do you want to bet? Squinting, Jiang Hai looked at the guy in front of him and said with disdain. Chapter 130. Bet. What bet? Hearing Jiang Hai's words, the man shut his mouth for the time being and asked hesitantly, Let's bet on whose cow will be the winner of the New York Livestock Exhibition in April. If your company wins, I'll personally lose $1 million to you. If my cow wins, then I'm sorry. You'll lose $1 million to me. If you don't have the money to pay, then you'll have to kneel down and kowtow to me 3 times. Jiang Hai smiled disdainfully at the man in front of him. $1 million. Hearing these words, many of the onlookers gasped. Well, they didn't think that the bet would be so big. Many of the onlookers nearby were ordinary farm owners. Although they weren't considered poor farmers in the United States, they were still considered middle class. After deducting the taxes they had to pay every year, it would be good if they had $40,000 or $50,000 left. Even if they made $50,000 a year, it would take 20 years to earn back $1 million. Ever since the United States started to control the exchange rate of the dollar, there had been no more problems with inflation. It was very likely that the value of $1 million now would be the same as 10 or 20 years later. In other words, it was pure profit. Thinking of this, these people all looked at the Cartwright Company's employee. In their eyes, this $1 million was pure profit for Cartwright Company. After all, they had been the winner of the New York Livestock Exhibition for 3 consecutive years. This was practically free money. Obviously, they didn't think that Jiang Hai could raise more than a middleman like Cartwright. But this employee didn't think so. He was very cautious. First, he was tempted by the $1 million. Second, he was worried about what he would do if he lost. He definitely couldn't afford $1 million, and the company definitely wouldn't pay $1 million for him. But if he had to kneel down and kowtow, he wouldn't be willing no matter what. In a democratic country like the United States, although the thing people worshipped the most was money, they wouldn't be willing to give up their self-esteem and kneel down and kowtow unless they were forced to. Therefore, he was still struggling. Looking at Jiang Hai's eyes, he was hesitant. Hey Paul, what are you hesitating for? This guy is giving you money for free. There's no reason for you not to accept it. That's right. You're too timid. Young man, if he doesn't want to bet with you, I'll bet with you. 1 million. How long will it take you to earn that much money? What's there to hesitate about? Seeing him hesitating, some people who were familiar with him started to shout loudly. Hearing these people's words, Paul licked his lips with hesitation as his eyes turned firm at once. Okay, I'll bet with you. Looking at Jiang Hai in front of him, Paul shouted. Hearing that, Jiang Hai shrugged too. It was fine for him to gamble. He wasn't doing it for the $1 million, but to prove himself. This guy dared to be so arrogant in front of him. If he didn't step on him, who would he step on? After this person agreed, some busybodies pulled over a lawyer on the spot. After all, this was an exhibition, and it was also for sales. Since it was for sales, a contract had to be signed. When signing the contract, the lawyer must be present. Now that Jiang Hai and this guy named Paul had a bet, naturally, the lawyer had to sign the agreement to take effect. After the lawyer came to ask for the opinions of both sides, he didn't say much and directly drafted an agreement. Here, it can't be called a bet, it can only be called an agreement. Then, Jiang Hai and this person signed their respective agreements. The two agreed that if the Cartwright Company's cattle won the top bid at the New York Livestock Exhibition in April this year, Jiang Hai would give Paul K $1 million, effective immediately. If the cattle from Jiang Hai's manor won the top bid, Paul K would give Jiang Hai $1 million, effective immediately. There were 3 copies of the agreement. Jiang Hai and K each held one, and the lawyer kept the other. After everything was done, Jiang Hai and Sh20 Clive didn't want to continue looking. After all, according to Paul K, 80% of the shops here belonged to his company. Jiang Hai didn't want to be pointed at here, and unable to buy anything. Rather than that, it was better to just leave. So Jiang Hai didn't hesitate and directly left. After the two walked out of the exhibition hall, Jiang Hai originally wanted to go home directly, but when he looked at the time, it was only 2 in the afternoon. It was still early. If he went back now, he didn't know if Luo Binsi and the others had returned. So his originally extinguished idea of going to see a school was reignited. Anyway, we have nothing to do now. Let's go see the nearby schools. Jiang Hai glanced at Sh20 Clive and said to her. When she heard Jiang Hai's words, Sandy, who was originally a little worried about whether Jiang Hai would lose, couldn't help but be taken aback. It seems that you don't care about your bet this time. Okay, let's go. Sh20 Clive gently shook her head and smiled at Jiang Hai. Then the two stepped into the car parked at the entrance of the exhibition and headed to Cambridge. Cambridge was a city, and though it was in a broad sense in Boston, it was a very different city from Boston, geographically, and in the reports of the city, opposite Boston on the other side of the Charles River. However, although this city wasn't big, and its population was only about 100,000, it was quite famous in the United States, and even the world. This was because there were 2 universities here, 2 super universities. One of them was the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Perhaps everyone was a little confused when they said this name. Massachusetts. Some people in China also called it Massachusetts. And this state's Institute of Technology was the legendary Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the most powerful existence in science and engineering. The other university is Harvard University, a giant in the education world. Other universities can't wait to let the world know about the President of the United States. But Harvard University has produced 8 presidents of the United States. Among them, the current president is from Harvard University. The number of Nobel Prize winners here is also in the hundreds of thousands or millions. Famous alumni, such as Bill Gates and Roosevelt, have all studied here. Of course, everyone knows that Bill Gates is not a good student, but he is famous. Driving not long after, the two arrived at this famous university. But to be honest, when walking into this university, Jiang Hai did not feel anything different. It may be because he really has no love for learning, or it may be because it is winter, and there is snow everywhere. Of course, it may also be because it is the holiday now, and there are not many students in the university. So, what he has read in novels before, such as the overwhelming academic atmosphere, the soul-shaking ethereal school, and the touching cultural accomplishment, there are none at all. Jiang Hai just walked around and saw some landmark buildings at the same time. He used his mobile phone to take a photo with them and sent it to his circle of friends. Recently, he almost didn't go on QQ much. He used WeChat more often, and his WeChat friends there are not many. In addition to his friends, there are only a few junior high school and high school classmates that he hardly contacted. In total, there are only a dozen people. It looks really lonely. Phew, we should go too. After taking the last photo, Jiang Hai couldn't help but take a look at the time. Although he didn't like to visit the university, since he visited, he should visit the places that should be visited. So unknowingly, although it was just walking around the main campus, it took him nearly 2 hours. There is no other way. Harvard is really not small. The entire campus area is 4,882 acres. Just the main campus alone is 224 acres. They walked around the main campus for nearly an hour. They just roughly looked at the other places. And the sky was already a little dark. Looking at the time on his mobile phone, it was already 4:30 in the afternoon. Jiang Hai exhaled a breath of hot air and said to Xanthi Clay. Just now, he had received a call from Luo Binsi, and they had already returned. As for the task that Jiang Hai gave them, the lobster, there was naturally no problem. Today their luck was quite good. Not only did they catch the lobster that Jiang Hai wanted, but they also caught a lot of prawns, crabs, and other things. This also allowed Jiang Hai's fishermen to have a preliminary understanding of Jiang Hai's fishing ground. When natural resources were extremely scarce outside, Jiang Hai's fishing ground was really a paradise. However, Jiang Hai was not the only one who wanted to enter the paradise. Luo Binsi also told Jiang Hai that when they were patrolling today, they saw a fishing boat in the distance, but when the fishing boat saw Luo Binsi, it quickly fled. However, it also reminded Jiang Hai that it seems that someone has been eyeing his fishing ground. Although it is possible to use a boat to patrol, after all, it takes too long and it is easy for others to take advantage of the loopholes. After Jiang Hai answered the phone, he was already thinking about buying a helicopter and a small agricultural plane. Even if it is just for patrolling, it is worth buying this thing. Of course, even if he wants to buy it, it will have to be tomorrow. He still has guests today. And okay. Hearing Jiang Hai's words, Shenty Clive, who had just helped Jiang Hai take a photo, also smiled and said. Then she walked behind Jiang Hai and walked out of the school. But just as the two walked out of the school gate, suddenly, a somewhat reckless figure rushed from the street in the distance. Jiang Hai's reaction was extremely fast. He dodged immediately, but after dodging, he remembered that Shenty Clive was still by his side. So he immediately pulled her, but he was still a bit late. Although he pulled her body over, this person still bumped into his shoulder. Chapter 131. Hey, watch your steps. Looking at Sandy being hit, Jiang Hai, as a man, naturally shouted at the person on the other side. However, that person didn't turn around. Instead, he ran forward at a faster speed. Something's wrong. Check if your phone and wallet are still there. Looking at the speed of this little guy, Jiang Hai narrowed his eyes and immediately said to Sh-20 Clive. Hearing Jiang Hai's words, Sandy reacted at this time. She immediately reached into her coat pocket. Sure enough, the wallet that should have been in her coat pocket had disappeared. Damn guy, you go and drive, I'll chase after him. Seeing that this guy was really a thief, Jiang Hai secretly cursed. He was really unlucky. It was not easy to go shopping with a girl. But the first thing he did was to meet the guy from the Cartwright Company, who provoked him. He was targeted by a thief when he was walking out of the university. It was really F***ed up. At the moment he was bold. He didn't say much. After throwing the car key directly to Sh-20 Clive, who was still in a daze, he chased in the direction the thief left. How fast was Jiang Hai? In the words of the NBA assistant coach who tested him, he was as fast as lightning. Of course, this was nonsense. But if he wanted to, it would not be a problem for him to participate in the Olympic 100-meter sprint final. After a few minutes, he had already rushed around the corner. As soon as he turned the corner, he saw the guy just now. At this time, this guy was in front of the roadside trash bin, looking for Sh-20 Clive's wallet that he had just stolen. He happened to turn around and saw Jiang Hai rushing over. He was shocked. He didn't have time to think about it. He stuffed the wallet into his tattered shirt, and then ran away crazily. Who the F***ck? Looking at his movements, Jiang Hai couldn't help but curse. Then, he continued to accelerate and rushed forward. The distance between the two was quickly narrowing, but just as he was about to catch the guy turned and went into a small alley just now. As previously mentioned, the Boston area was the oldest city. Soon after the European colonists came to North America, they established the Boston area here. Therefore, the urban area here was very narrow. It could be said that the roads here were the most difficult to walk in the metropolitan cities in the United States. Although Cambridge was not considered the urban area of Boston, the situation here was similar. It was winter now. The government would clear the snow and ice on the main roads, but not on some small roads. When Jiang Hai also turned a corner and stepped into this small alley, he almost fell down in an instant, because at this time, there was a thick layer of ice on the ground of this small alley. This ice was not pure and transparent but colorful. There were all kinds of garbage on it. In some corners, there were a lot of human or animal excrement. As soon as Jiang Hai walked into this small alley, he subconsciously wanted to go out. It can be imagined how disgusting it would be to fall down here. But when he looked at the thief who was moving quickly in front of him, he couldn't help but grit his teeth. Damn it! If it was another time, he would have caught him long ago. He wouldn't be in such a difficult situation now. But Jiang Hai didn't want to let this guy go. Looking at the sky that was about to turn dark, Jiang Hai secretly cursed. He moved his feet and ran in this small alley. Fortunately, Jiang Hai usually doesn't like to wear formal clothes, so his shoes now are military whips bought at the outdoor goods store. This kind of shoe has a strong grip. Although running on the ice is still very slippery, at least if you are careful, you won't fall so easily. But the kid on the opposite side is obviously used to such a scene. He didn't care about the garbage on the ground, or even the excrement. He ran out of the small alley quickly. When Jiang Hai chased out of the small alley, this guy had already pulled away a lot. If it weren't for Jiang Hai's good enough eyesight, he would have been unable to catch this guy's figure. But fortunately, he finally left that damn alley. Jiang Hai instantly ran and chased the thin figure in the distance. The two of them, one chasing and one fleeing, ran for about 20 minutes. The kid's stamina was finally about to run out, and his speed was getting slower and slower. If he wasn't very familiar with the surrounding terrain, he might have been caught by Jiang Hai long ago. Jiang Hai also stepped on the ice and followed him all the way. As he turned into a small alley again, Jiang Hai also followed in. But after entering, Jiang Hai couldn't help but smile because this small alley is dead. At this time, he saw this figure running quickly to the innermost part of the alley, and Jiang Hai also breathed a sigh of relief. He slowly tidied up his clothes, stepped on the hard ice, and walked towards this figure. Still running? Why are you running? Give me back my wallet. Looking at the thief in front of him, Jiang Hai chuckled and said in English as he walked. Seeing Jiang Hai's figure coming over, the thief couldn't help but be a little scared. His hands clutched his clothes tightly. Every time Jiang Hai took a step forward, he couldn't help but take a step back. Not long after, he was already leaning against the cold wall at the entrance of the alley. Jiang Hai also walked in front of him and looked at him condescendingly. On his small face, only a pair of big eyes were staring at Jiang Hai, but there was no sign of weakness or fear. Hey kid, you won't cry until you see the coffin, right? Give it to me. Seeing that the thief didn't return the wallet in such a situation, Jiang Hai couldn't help but smack his lips. He wasn't a good-tempered person. Without saying anything, his right hand instantly grabbed the thief, but the thief was flexible enough. He bent down and used the sliding force of the ice to instantly slip under Jiang Hai's legs. But when he wanted to run again, Jiang Hai directly grabbed his collar with his left hand and lifted him up. When he caught him, Jiang Hai was a little surprised because this thief looked about 1.6 meters tall. Maybe because it was winter and he was wearing a lot of clothes, he didn't look too light. But when Jiang Hai lifted him up, he was stunned for a moment because this thief really seemed to be too light, only about 60 or 70 pounds. This height and weight made Jiang Hai a little surprised, but it only surprised him for a moment. Then he was ready to look for the wallet. Bang 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 bang. However, this thief didn't seem to admit defeat so easily. Although he didn't make any sound, his body kept struggling, especially his legs. He kept kicking the door next to the alley, making a harsh sound. Just as Jiang Hai was about to take out the wallet, the door on the other side was opened. And at the same time, it wasn't just this door that opened. There were more than a dozen doors that opened at the same time. Then from the door, 20 or 30 people came out. These people were both men and women. No matter if it was a man or a woman, they were all dressed like the child in Jiang Hai's hands. They were all tattered, and the men were basically dirty. As for the women, some of the older ones were much cleaner. At least there was no black ash on their faces, and their hair was combed. Some of the younger ones were basically not much different from the boys. When they saw Jiang Hai and this person, a trace of panic flashed in their eyes, but after the panic they calmed down. The women didn't seem to see this scene, and turned back to the room. The remaining 13 men surrounded Jiang Hai. Some of them even took out switchblades from their pockets, and looked at Jiang Hai with an unfriendly face. From the time these people came out to Jiang Hai, they didn't say a word. But Jiang Hai understood what these people meant. Since Jiang Hai came, then they had no intention of letting Jiang Hai go. Hey, it's still a gang. Looking at these people in front of him, Jiang Hai didn't dare to be careless. After all, these people were holding weapons in their hands. Judging from their faces, these people weren't very old. They were basically around 20 years old. This was the time when people were most reckless. Although Jiang Hai's physical fitness was good, he still had to be careful. Come on. Throwing the thief in his hand aside, Jiang Hai looked down and found that his side was really clean. There wasn't even a wooden board. It seemed that he could only fight with his bare hands. Seeing Jiang Hai's actions, the men here looked at each other. The two youngest men standing at the front were pushed out first. These two guys didn't have weapons in their hands. They also knew that the purpose of being pushed out was to test Jiang Hai's level. So after looking at each other, they didn't say much and directly rushed towards Jiang Hai. If it was the old Jiang Hai, he might be a little flustered, but don't forget. Recently, he had been learning martial arts from Bale, and he practiced almost every day. Coupled with his strong physical fitness, he didn't think much of an attack like this. He casually lifted his leg and kicked the chest of the boy on his right. The huge impact caused the boy to stagnate in the air for a moment. Then he flew out and smashed into the door not far away. As for the other boy, he was in a much worse state than him. After Jiang Hai kicked the person on the left, he directly grabbed the clothes of the person on the right and threw him straight towards the people holding the switchblade. When these people saw this scene, they were stunned for a moment. They subconsciously put away their switchblades. After all, they didn't want to hurt their own people. However, the result of this was that they were all knocked down by the young man who threw them. Taking advantage of this opportunity, Jiang Hai took a big stride and went towards the people who didn't have a switchblade in their hands. He wanted to pick the weakest among them. Chapter 132. Then, he squatted down and dodged the opponent's fist. Then he used two more nest fists and directly hit the stomach. Then he jumped up and used a knee strike and a whip kick. The two people standing at the front instantly fell to the ground and lost their ability to fight. After landing, he kicked a person's calf and used the ice to sweep this person down. Then he took a step forward and grabbed a person. He pulled him back and used his elbow to hit the person's jaw. Then, he used his body as a cushion to block the second wave of attacks from the people around him. Then, he threw another person over his shoulder and blocked the opponent's fist. Then he closed in an uppercut, followed by a chop to the throat. Then, he threw another person over his shoulder into the crowd. While he suppressed a few people, he rushed to the others and hit the throat with a hand knife. Then he stepped on the feet and used the hardness of the military whip to kick the opponent's knee. Then, he grabbed the opponent's head and used a knee strike to kill another person. Then, he moved into the arms of another person and used his elbow to hit the back of the opponent's head. At the same time, he used his knee to hit the opponent's stomach. There was a huge difference between those who had learned fighting techniques and those who hadn't. If Jiang Hai had not learned martial arts, he would have been able to deal with these people. If they did not have weapons, Jiang Hai would have been able to take a few hits. However, in the situation where the opponent had weapons, he was much more passive. After all, although his body was at the limit of a human's body, there would still be 2 holes in his body if he was hit. However, now that he had such skills, Jiang Hai's self-confidence was extremely inflated. While he was trying to think of a way to make the people with switchblades unable to come forward, he had already rushed to the other side, where there were also unarmed people. There were a total of 13 people here. 4 of them were armed with switchblades, and 9 of them were not. 2 of them were taken care of by him, and 7 of them were still alive. The remaining 7 people, under Jiang Hai's attack, were swept away like a whirlwind, instantly falling to the ground. After all, the other party took the initiative to look for trouble, and they were also armed. Jiang Hai wasn't going to be soft-hearted. Although it was the same as the last time, it was a deadly blow, but it was definitely not light. These people who were hit in the face were destined to be covered in blood. Their nose bones and facial bones would definitely be broken. Jiang Hai didn't hold back too much even if he hit them in other positions, although he didn't hit them to the extent of rupturing their internal organs. However, with his immense strength, it was not a problem for him to break some bones. At the very least, he had to ensure that they completely lost their ability to fight. Of course, after this battle, these guys would probably have to lie in the hospital for at least a month. The people who had been knocked down by Jiang Hai lay on the ground and covered their wounds. However, they didn't curse. They just covered their wounds and let out low growls. I didn't expect them to be tough guys. Looking at these people, Jiang Hai tidied up his clothes and said softly. At this time, the people who were first thrown by Jiang Hai, the 4 people who had weapons in their hands, also got up. It was so lively just now, but in fact, Jiang Hai only took about 10 seconds to deal with these people. After all, Jiang Hai's speed was not ordinary. When he dealt with these people, the people on the other side had just gotten up. This time, only facing these 4 guys, Jiang Hai felt a lot more confident in his heart. However, the weapons in their hands would always be a little troublesome, so he rushed over first and kicked away the switchblade in a guy's hand. At the same time, he stepped on the wrist of a person who hadn't gotten up yet. The huge force instantly broke the bones of this person's hand. This time, not to mention the switchblade, he couldn't pick up anything else. But even if his wrist was broken, this person just trembled and opened his mouth wide. But he didn't make a scream. Looking at this scene, Jiang Hai felt a little creepy. But at this time, it was not the time to care about these things. He turned around and gave the tough guy under his foot a kick. The tough guy slid back with the help of the ice and blocked the way of a person. He then stuck to the person who was stabbing at him with a switchblade. It could be seen that this guy really wanted to fight to the death with Jiang Hai. Generally speaking, if one didn't want to die in a street scuffle, it was more of a scaring effect than a weapon. Even if there was an accidental cut, it would only be a bloody wound on the body. It was an external injury. Unless there was excessive blood loss, it was easy to treat. However, this guy really wanted to kill Jiang Hai because his action was to stab. As long as this knife pierced into the body, whether it hurt the heart, liver, spleen, lungs, or kidney, it would be fatal. Even if it only cut the intestines, it would still be fatal. It could be seen that this person didn't think too much at this time. Since they were playing around and trying to kill, Jiang Hai wouldn't be polite. Well, in fact, Jiang Hai was the one who dug out the eyeballs first. But humans always like to blame others. Jiang Hai was also a human, so naturally he was also like this. Looking at the dagger coming at him, Jiang Hai's body dodged. At the same time, his right hand stretched out like lightning and grabbed the person's wrist. Then he used brute force. The huge force directly twisted the man's arm like a fried dough twist. Jiang Hai used force and directly sent the dagger back into the man's body. The moment the switchblade entered the man's flesh, the man's eyes instantly widened. He looked at Jiang Hai with a face of disbelief. Then he used his other hand to cover his wound. His whole body trembled as he knelt down, but he still didn't scream. Seeing the man fall, Jiang Hai glanced at the blood on his hand. Originally, he thought that the man would be very scared and even run away. But his consciousness didn't feel this way. Instead, he calmly shook the blood on his hand. Although this was the first time he fought so fiercely, he didn't seem to be disgusted by it. It seemed like he didn't feel anything when he killed someone because of this. This made Jiang Hai's brows wrinkle. This kind of feeling made his liver tremble. His future path was to become a homicidal maniac. If this was the case, then it was really not good. But fortunately, he knew that even if he had such thoughts, it wasn't the time to think about it now. After all, he was still in the middle of a battle. On the nearby wall, Jiang Hai wiped the blood on his hand. Then he looked at the last person who was still standing. He was also the last person holding a weapon. At this time, The sky was gradually getting dark, but his vision was still not affected. This person saw that his 12 companions were all lying down in a flash. He was also trembling in fear. The knife in his hand clearly couldn't provide him any sense of security. His whole body was trembling like a sieve. His eyes were full of fear. He clearly didn't exercise much, but the sweat on his forehead had already gathered into a stream. His face, which was already very dirty, was now even dirtier. "You're the only one left. Why aren't you coming up?" Raising his head, Jiang Hai looked at him casually and asked faintly. Hearing Jiang Hai's words, the man looked around in horror. In fact, if there was space now, he would have run away. But unfortunately at this time, the door here was tightly shut, and the wall behind him was also sealed. He really didn't know what to do. He didn't want to be beaten, but now it seemed that it was impossible not to be beaten. Catch him, catch him, catch him, catch him. Just when he was extremely frightened, a sudden ear-piercing alarm rang from afar. Then, under the lead of an F-650, 2 police cars quickly arrived in front of the alley. As the 3 cars stopped, 4 police officers and Shinty Clive jumped out of the cars and ran into the small alley. Seeing the police arrive, the person here didn't say anything. He directly threw the knife in his hand far away, then habitually squatted down with his hands on his head. Seeing his shameless behavior, Jiang Hai couldn't help but raise his eyebrows. How proactive. The person inside, squat down and put your hands on your head. But soon, Jiang Hai knew that it was not a good thing to not take the initiative at this time, because the 4 police officers had also walked into the small alley at this time. When they saw the people on the ground with their faces full of blood, broken arms, and confused, they had already pulled out their guns and shouted at Jiang Hai, who was still standing in the small alley with a righteous face. "Is there a mistake? I'm the victim." Hearing the words of these police officers, Jiang Hai said to them with some dissatisfaction, "I'll say it again, put your hands on your head, squat down now, right now." However, the police officers obviously didn't give Jiang Hai a chance to explain, and directly said loudly. Looking at the black muzzles in front of him, Jiang Hai's heart flashed with a trace of dissatisfaction. It was the first time that someone pointed a gun at him directly, but he knew that this was not the time to test whether his body could withstand a bullet, so he still held his head and squatted down. After Jiang Hai also squatted down, 3 of the 4 police officers quickly ran over. One of them pointed a gun at the guy who confronted Jiang Hai just now, one pointed a gun at Jiang Hai, and the other one checked the situation of the people lying on the ground. The last police officer who didn't come over was contacting the ambulance, while looking at SH-20 Clive at the same time. However, SH-20 Clive was a teacher after all, and she knew the law. At this time, she didn't panic, but after the man contacted the ambulance and reinforcements, she explained her and Jiang Hai's situation. After learning that Jiang Hai was indeed the victim, the police came over and said a few words to the police officer, who pointed a gun at Jiang Hai. Then the police officer put away the gun in his hand. After putting away the gun, the police officer helped Jiang Hai up and said with a serious face, "Sir, I'm sorry, this is our duty. Please come back to the police station with us later. We need to record your statement." Chapter 133. Sorry, I'm late. Lawyer Moses went to Miami today. He's on his way back now, so he asked me to handle this case first. As the office door opened, Penelope Daller, who had met Jiang Hai once, walked in from outside. For Moses Adams, although Jiang Hai did not have any company acquisition proposals, nor did he have any international lawsuits to fight, such a rich person was still his high-quality customer. Logically speaking, as long as Jiang Hai needed it, he would immediately appear in front of Jiang Hai. Unfortunately, he wanted to appear in front of Jiang Hai immediately, but the flight did not allow it. Before Jiang Hai went to the police station, he called Moses Adams. After learning that he was in Miami, Jiang Hai wanted to change lawyers, but Moses said that he would come back immediately. Sometimes, Jiang Hai cared too much about his reputation, so he did not say anything, and was directly taken into the office by the police. Fortunately, when the police learned of Jiang Hai's identity and determined that Jiang Hai was someone they couldn't afford to offend, Their attitude towards Jiang Hai was still very good. They didn't need to sit outside to record the statement, so they specifically left an empty office for Jiang Hai. There was also hot coffee to drink. Although the coffee was instant, in this cold weather, having a cup of hot coffee could make people feel a little better. After asking about what happened today, the police went out to deal with it. As for Jiang Hai and SH-20 Clive, they temporarily stayed there. The two of them needed to be completely sure that this matter had nothing to do with Jiang Hai before they could leave. The two of them were bored, so they just sat there and watched the NBA on the TV in the office. Fortunately, although SH-20 Clive was not a fan, he still had some understanding of this thing. The two of them talked and laughed, and they had a good time. Meanwhile, at Jiang Hai's home, Jiang Hai had already asked Mrs. Philemon to go to his house to prepare dinner. After learning that SH-20 Clive's father was a French chef, he did not need to show off. He just needed to make these things taste the same. No matter how gorgeous they were, they could not be more gorgeous than French food, right? When Penelope came in, Jiang Hai and SH-20 Clive were talking about the Celtics' hopes for this year's playoffs. When she came in, the two of them were really shocked, but after greeting them, Penelope got to the point. It's nothing. This is not a big case. Maybe I was too harsh. When he heard Penelope's words, Jiang Hai smiled and touched the tip of his nose. To be honest, Jiang Hai also felt a little awkward when he saw Penelope. After all, she was not an ordinary lawyer. Even if she did not have a good relationship with her father was still Jiang Hai's subordinate. Therefore, when he saw this familiar face, it was difficult for him to order her around like he did Moses Adams. It's good that you're fine. I'll go and understand the situation first. Because she had come in a hurry, she had only received the facts that Moses Adams had told her on the way there. She was not very clear about the specific situation, so she had to go and understand it now. Jiang Hai did not care about this. He gestured for Penelope to go ahead, and then Penelope left. Jiang Hai and SH-20 Clive continued to sit there and watch TV. When the night's game was about to end, the policeman who had brought them in came in with Penelope. However, Penelope's eyes were a little red, which made Jiang Hai a little puzzled. Mr. Jiang Hai, we have understood your situation. You can leave now. Looking at Jiang Hai, the policeman first came up and shook his hand. Then he smiled kindly and said to Jiang Hai, this incident was actually very easy to pinpoint. After the police reinforcements arrived, the place was searched and everyone was arrested. Those who should be sent to the hospital were sent to the hospital. Those who were lightly injured, and those women, were all arrested and sent to the police station. In fact, this incident was not difficult to understand, as long as it was investigated. Jiang Hai did not know these people before this. He had come out to play today. SH-20 Clive's wallet was stolen, and there was also a surveillance camera. Jiang Hai chased the thief, and was led to that place. Those people took out switchblades, which was also true. Jiang Hai, to put it bluntly, was just self-defense. At the same time, there was no disability or death. This was not excessive self-defense. So no matter what, it would not be Jiang Hai's responsibility. Even the police had nothing to say. Thank you, then we will go first. Hearing that he could leave, Jiang Hai also smiled and shook hands with the policeman. Although it was very warm in the police station, to be honest, ordinary people were not willing to come here for nothing. Now that he heard that he could leave, Jiang Hai did not hesitate, and was ready to leave directly. As for the unfinished football game, it was not important. As for SH-20 Clive, her thoughts were the same as Jiang Hai's. Who would be willing to come to the police station for nothing? Phew, today was a day of fun, betting, arresting people. And in the end, I ended up in the police station. It's a bit unlucky. Hee, but fortunately it's settled satisfactorily. Dinner is ready at my manor. Miss Clive, let's go. By the way, Miss Dale, come with us. Thank you for coming over so late. I'll treat you to dinner. After saying goodbye to the police, Jiang Hai and others walked out of the police station. Jiang Hai took a long breath. This is the free air. Cough, I was originally free. However, staying in the police station, it really felt that the air there was about to solidify, which was very uncomfortable. That, sir. Hearing Jiang Hai's words, Penelope, who was still hesitating, couldn't help but slow down her pace. As if she had made up her mind, she raised her head and said to Jiang Hai, Hearing her words, Jiang Hai, who was still thinking about steak and lobster, couldn't help but be stunned for a moment. Then he turned his head curiously and looked at her. Is she going to refuse my invitation? Sir, can you please not sue those people? Seeing Jiang Hai's doubtful eyes, Penelope seemed to have made up her mind. She looked into Jiang Hai's eyes and said word by word, What do you mean? As a lawyer, the last thing they can't have is their own heart. They exist to serve their clients. Of course, sometimes they need to give better advice to some people. But sometimes, especially when facing people like Jiang Hai, who is not short of money at all, the most important goal is to vent his anger for him or fight for his interests. Just like Moses Adams, no matter what the town hall or the town's police chief was like, he didn't give in. He didn't relent in the slightest. He only gave Jiang Hai the things he collected when Jiang Hai was a little shaken. As for what to do, it was still up to Jiang Hai to decide. He always knew who was the boss and who was the employee. For a good lawyer, things like pity didn't exist from the beginning. Since he was standing in front of Jiang Hai, as his lawyer, he had to do everything according to Jiang Hai's instructions. This was a good lawyer, not a person with a strong sense of morality, who went against his own lawyer for others. You could call them cold-blooded or shameless, but only such lawyers were truly good lawyers. Although it was wrong to look at it from the perspective of human nature and morality, did this world talk about these things? So Penelope's words made Jiang Hai a little unhappy. Originally, because she was an acquaintance, his mood changed a little. He frowned and looked at her as he asked, Are they? Sai sir, they are actually a group of pitiful people. Hearing Jiang Hai's words, although she felt a little guilty about Jiang Hai's questioning, Penelope daily still braced herself and said, These children are actually deaf and mute. After hesitating for a moment, Penelope whispered to Jiang Hai. Hearing her words, Jiang Hai, who was originally very unhappy, was stunned for a moment. Originally, he was still thinking, why are these guys so unyielding? It turned out that this was the reason why no one screamed when they were beaten up like that. Hearing Penelope's words, Jiang Hai's heart stirred, but it was quickly extinguished. Yes, some congenital defects were indeed pitiful, but this could not be a reason for them to commit crimes. What's more, these people wanted to kill him, which was absolutely not allowed. If a person with a defect worked hard, he would be praised all over the world. But if they only took advantage of this to commit crimes, no matter what others thought, at least Jiang Hai absolutely disapproved of it in his heart. A pitiful person must have a hateful side. At the very least, before fully understanding the course of events, one should not jump to conclusions. Not to mention, in such an incident, Jiang Hai appeared as a victim. This can't be a reason for them to commit crimes. Jiang Hai had always been like this. So after listening to Penelope's words, Jiang Hai said stiffly. After hearing Jiang Hai's words, Penelope's face became a little ugly. As for SH-20 Clive, if she were a bystander, she might pity these people. But she was the one who was robbed. And she just saw with her own eyes that the switchblades were used as evidence. Those things were not toys. And they would indeed die if they were stabbed. She thought that she was not a saint who would take other people's lives as a product of pity. She couldn't, and Jiang Hai couldn't. This was a matter of principle and couldn't be changed. Chapter 134. Are you really going to sue them? Sitting in the passenger seat of the pickup truck, Shinty Clive hesitated and said to Jiang Hai. Hearing her words, although she didn't say it clearly, Jiang Hai also knew what she was talking about. After Penelope told him about the situation of those people, Jiang Hai was indeed a little angry at the time. But now that he thought about it, he was really helpless. If he didn't sue them, he would be angry. But if he did sue them, they wouldn't be able to pay for it. At most, they would be locked up, which would not benefit him. The most important thing was that if he really sued them, it would give others the illusion that he was bullying these people. This was something that Jiang Hai didn't want to do. I don't know, let's not think about it for the time being. These people seem to have committed more than 1 or 2 crimes. They should have done this kind of thing many times. Maybe after the police interrogate them, The police won't let them go even if I don't sue them. Let's not think about it for now. Let's go eat first, I'm starving to death. After being silent for a long time, Jiang Hai decided to put aside his hesitation for the time being. He had to deal with tonight's dinner first. Good idea. Hearing that Jiang Hai hadn't made up his mind, Shinty Clive also knew that it was meaningless to say anything at this time. Not to mention Jiang Hai. If she let these people go, she would actually be a little unhappy in her heart. Since she couldn't make this decision, she would wait until later. Then, the conversation between the two of them returned to how it was before this incident had happened. Jiang Hai's F-650 quickly drove out of the downtown area of Boston and rushed in the direction of Winthrop. Because it was already past 7 o'clock in the evening, there might be some traffic on the road in the city center, but the highway in this city had passed their peak hour. Jiang Hai could drive here at the maximum speed on the road that had been cleared. It would have taken more than an hour to get there, but he rushed back to his manor before 8 o'clock. The gate of the manor was rebuilt after Jiang Hai took over the manor. Although it looked very ordinary, it actually had an automatic authentication system. When Jiang Hai came in, he only needed to scan his face. Of course, there was also a triple lock and password switch. In Jiang Hai's house, except for the workers' room, the rooms in his villa were basically double locked. Usually, they could be opened with a password. If there was no password, they had to open with a key. Of course, the door could also be locked from the inside, but it had to be inside the room. As the gate slowly opened, Jiang Hai's car also slowly drove into the manor. When his car stopped in front of his villa, the gate of his villa was also opened. Xiaobai and Xiaohuang quickly ran out of the villa. On top of Xiaobai's head was the snow squirrel that Jiang Hai had brought back from the forest, Daya. The two dogs and one squirrel quickly ran in front of Jiang Hai's car and roared at Jiang Hai's car. This gave Shinty Clive, who was about to get out of the car, a fright. After all, anyone who saw these two huge beasts would not let down their guard easily. His hand was already on the door handle, but when he saw the two dogs, he could not open the door. Go, go, go. Go and play somewhere else. Don't worry, they won't bite. They are welcoming us. Jiang Hai turned around and saw the fear in Shinty Clive's heart. He immediately got out of the car and kicked Xiaohuang and Xiaobai's buttocks to chase them away. At the same time, he explained to Shinty Clive. Shinty Clive was stunned when she heard Jiang Hai's words. Then, she saw that the two dogs really ran to the side after being kicked away by Jiang Hai. They stopped barking and did not seem to be aggressive. Only then did she breathe a sigh of relief. She knew that a manor owner like Jiang Hai would raise dogs, and he would raise quite a few of them. After all, herding cows required the help of cattle dogs. Although her family had never raised a dog before, she was already mentally prepared. After getting out of the car, Shinty Clive was still looking at the two dogs. To be honest, ever since the two dogs followed Jiang Hai, they ate well and lived well. Most importantly, Jiang Hai had used his blood to transform them. Not only did their intelligence increase, but their size also increased. The Caucasian Mastiff and the Green Wolf Mastiff, which were originally large dogs, seemed to have grown bigger after being nourished for a few months. The Green Wolf Mastiff in particular looked more and more like a wolf, but it was bigger than a wolf. Even if it was compared to the largest North American gray wolf on Earth, it was still bigger than the North American gray wolf. Its claws and fangs could not be seen normally, but when it stood up, it was indeed a little scary. As for the Caucasian Xiaobai, it was more than half a size bigger than the Green Wolf Mastiff. Although it was not as fierce, at least in terms of weight and size, the current Xiaobai was more intimidating than Xiaohuang. Their fur was glossy and soft, and there was no strange smell on their bodies. If someone who knew dogs was here, they would realize that these two dogs were really good dogs. Even their front teeth had changed a lot over the past few days. Not only had they grown bigger, but their fur had also become much softer. Jiang Hai was a little worried. It was still a squirrel, but if it continued to grow, it would become a mink. Speaking of which, it was the smartest of the three little guys. As soon as it saw Shinty Clive get out of the car, it rolled its eyes and jumped down from Xiaobai's head. Then it quickly climbed up Shinty Clive's foot and rubbed against her palm. Wow, little cutie, what's its name? Sure enough, women's resistance to cute things wasn't high. Under the attack of the front teeth, Clive said with a face full of surprise. It's called front teeth. Okay, let's go in first. Seeing that Clive's eyes lit up when she saw the front teeth, Hai couldn't help but smile and shake his head. This guy's IQ developed really quickly. He was already trying to please the people around him. And okay. Hearing Hai's words, Xiaobai and Xiaohuang stood up first and led the two into the villa. As soon as they entered the villa, a hot wind blew in their faces. Hai and Sandy couldn't help but take a deep breath. Although it was very warm in the car, it was because of the air conditioner. When the air conditioner was turned on, there was no way to open the windows. Fortunately, Hai didn't smoke, so the air in the car was passable. But it was definitely not good. When they got out of the car, although the air was good, it was too cold. This time when they entered the house, the air was good and warm. Hai was a northerner. Northerners were actually more afraid of the cold than southerners, because there was no heating in the south. In winter, the southerners were still fine because the temperature was more than 10 degrees, but the people in the Central Plains and Sichuan were much worse. The temperature outside was 2 or 3 degrees, and the temperature inside the house was also 2 or 3 degrees. It was really unbearable. Although Boston belonged to the northern region in terms of latitude and longitude, because it was close to the Atlantic Ocean, it was considered an oceanic climate. Therefore, the temperature here in winter wasn't particularly cold. Ordinary people, in order to save some air, would turn on the heater in winter and let the temperature reach about 10 degrees to get through the winter. This was also the reason why in many American movies, the actors had to wear sweaters and woolen clothes in the house. Of course, there were also environmental protection organizations that said that this was to save energy and reduce emissions, but Hai didn't know the specifics. He only knew that he was very afraid of the cold, so in this winter, his villa was turned on 24 hours a day, and the temperature was very high, constant at 24 degrees. As for the air conditioner, it wouldn't work if it was -7 degrees, so he had to rely on it. Then he would freeze to death. Wow, your house is really warm. As soon as they entered Hai's villa, Clive whispered. At the same time, his eyes were also looking at the villa in front of him. Hai's decoration was very good in the eyes of ordinary people. At least, the things he could buy were more expensive in the market. Although there weren't any treasures, when he walked in, he would still be amazed. Of course, there was no way to compare with those real rich people. Moreover, Hai wasn't very willing to spend money on antiques. It was true that he had 300 million yuan, but it was all spent on this manor. Before the manor had enough output, he didn't need to consider these things. Give me your coat, I'll hang it up for you. Change your shoes here. While Clive was looking at Hai's villa, Hai had already taken off his coat and walked over with a pair of slippers that no one had ever seen before. There's no other way. I don't have a woman here, so I only have men's slippers. Seeing Xanthi strangely looking at the pair of gray slippers in his hand, Hai shrugged and said to her, "Hee, it's okay." Looking at Hai's appearance, Clive also laughed, then took off his coat and handed it to Hai, then changed into the slippers. At this time, a figure came out from the kitchen in the distance. "Hey boss, you're finally back. If you didn't come back, the steak would have been cold. Haha, little girl from the Clive family, you're in luck today. This is the beef that our boss treasured, and the lobster that Ai Dehua just caught today." As soon as the figure saw Hai, his mouth began to chatter. Hearing this voice, Hai didn't need to look at his face to know that it was Philemon. In Hai's manner, Hai didn't know who was the best cook, but he had recently gotten used to eating Mrs. Philemon's food. Therefore, before Hai left today, he also asked Mrs. Philemon to prepare dinner for him. It seemed that Mrs. Philemon was forced to come by his wife, but it also showed that Mrs. Philemon valued this meal very much. Chapter 135. This is steak. Take your time, there's plenty more. When Hai and Clive arrived at the dining room, they imagined that there would be red wine, candles, whips, and so on. Cough. It seemed like there was something strange mixed in. But we can ignore it for the time being, because there was no such thing. Everything was still the same as before, but there was a new white tablecloth on the table. The more Jiang Hai looked at it, the more he felt that it was similar to a curtain in the villa. But before he could confirm it, Philip and Mrs. Philip had already served dinner. Eating in Jiang Hai's home was destined to be a place that wasn't particular about food. There weren't any particular people here. Whether it was cowboys or fishermen, they all came and went roughly, so the things they cooked were also rough. There were a total of 4 large plates and a pot. Inside the pot was a cheddar soup, the most famous soup in Boston. Among the 4 large plates, there was a huge lobster on one of them. It seemed that this was Robin's harvest today. Jiang Hai looked at the lobster. It was about 16 or 17 pounds. Although it was not the king of lobsters, it was definitely one of the biggest lobsters. In addition to this huge lobster, there was also a plate of grilled steak. In other Western restaurants, steak was eaten in pieces, but in Jiang Hai's restaurant, it was eaten in plates. On the other 2 plates, there was a pile of salad made of vegetables and fruits, and on the other, there was a freshly baked bread. Although the arrangement was not particular, it made people feel that it was very realistic. Perhaps for some people, doing this is disrespectful to them, but Jiang Hai doesn't care, because there was no need for him to make friends with such people. To put it bluntly, he was still a nouveau riche. He didn't care about what others thought of him. He only cared about whether he was comfortable or not. That was all. Uncle Turner, Aunt Turner, you should also join us. Xanthe Clive stood up and said politely to the 2 of them when she saw the Philmonts carrying out the 5 large plates. No need. Don't you see what time it is now? We've already finished eating. You guys take your time. Hearing her words, Mrs. Philemon laughed. In fact, they were all from the same small town, so they were very clear about Clive's family situation. Generally speaking, this family was not bad. His father used to be a chef. His culinary skills were not bad, and his temper was not bad. Her mother was an ordinary housewife. After Sh20 Clive graduated from university, she returned to the town's primary school to be a teacher. In fact, she could have found a better job, but she still returned to her hometown Winthrop. Therefore, the people in the small town had a good impression of this family, because of their work at Shite Clive. Seeing that their boss had brought this girl back, they felt that there might be something going on between the 2 of them. If Jiang Hai knew what they were thinking, he would probably be stunned for a moment, because it seemed that probably he had no intention of pursuing Xanthe Clive. Well, it didn't count when he was sleeping. At least he didn't have such intentions when he was conscious. Okay then, be careful when you go back. Seeing that the Philemons decided not to stay and be a third wheel, Cindy Clive smiled and sent the 2 of them back. This made Jiang Hai, who originally wanted to eat immediately after coming back, feel too embarrassed to use his knife and fork. Instead, he followed Cindy Clive and sent the 2 of them out of the house before returning to the dining room. Let's start eating now. Looking at the food on the table, Jiang Hai rubbed his mouth, licked his lips subconsciously, and said seriously. Seeing his appearance, Xanthe Clive couldn't help but chuckle. She felt more and more that Jiang Hai was very interesting. Then she took the initiative to sit opposite Jiang Hai, picked up a piece of steak, and put it on Jiang Hai's plate. Jiang Hai, who originally wanted to directly eat, couldn't help but stare blankly. Then he picked the largest piece of steak and put it on Xanthe Clive's plate. Seeing Jiang Hai's choice, Xanthe Clive couldn't help but laugh and roll her eyes. What are you looking at? Eat. Unfortunately, this flirtatious supercilious look was like playing the lute to a cow in front of Jiang Hai. When Jiang Hai saw that she was only looking at him without eating, he said directly to her. Hearing Jiang Hai's words, Xanthe Clive also smiled. She picked up her knife and fork and cut a piece of steak that looked a little cold. In fact, as a woman, a beautiful woman, she didn't eat much. To be honest, the 3 most important things about food were its color, aroma, and taste. First of all, there was no need to consider the color of the steak made by Mrs. Philip. Because Jiang Hai only ate fully cooked steak, this piece of steak was almost like a piece of charred meat. There was no beauty in it at all. Second, the aroma. Because it was a little cold, It didn't smell very fragrant. Last but not least, the taste. Although Sh20 Clive hadn't tasted it, she felt that if the color and aroma of the steak weren't the best, the taste wouldn't be too good either. Although Jiang Hai was a rich man and had 20,000 cows, Sh20 Clive didn't raise any cows at home. However, she knew very well that it wasn't easy for a cow to raise premium grade A beef. However, raising a cow by itself required a lot of attention to detail and was very troublesome. After all, Sh20 Clive had worked in a Western restaurant before. Therefore, she had more or less attended ranchers who specialized in raising premium grade A beef. Basically, to raise such a cow, the number of cowboys, and not the size of the pasture, was determined. A cowboy who worked more than 10 hours a day could at most raise 3 such cows. That way, the meat of the cow would have a perfect marbling pattern. Otherwise, why would a pound of usable beef be sold for $3, while this cow was sold for $300? That was why it was expensive. However, Jiang Hai obviously wasn't like that. Therefore, she guessed that Jiang Hai's so-called marbling pattern cow was either a bluff from Luo Binci and the others, or he himself didn't know much about it. Regarding this, she wasn't very familiar with Jiang Hai yet, so it wasn't easy for her to say. But in any case, Jiang Hai's hospitality to her was a kind gesture. Moreover, he also said that the beef had a marbled pattern, so it was estimated that there was a premium grade. This kind of beef was not cheap. At least, as a teacher in a small town, even if she wanted to eat it every day, she still couldn't afford it, so she was prepared to try it. When her fork touched Jiang Hai's steak, the moment the knife gently cut it open, she couldn't help but feel surprised. Because the feeling of the steak being cut open was very strange. This feeling was really similar to the feeling she had when she secretly ate her father's steak in that French restaurant. It was similar to the feeling she had when she secretly ate her father's steak. There was no trace of tendon in the meat. It was completely the firmness of the beef itself. When the knife cut open the muscle fibers on both sides, the feeling was really difficult to describe in words. Was it a waste of strength? No, but was it easy to cut? It didn't seem to be. Just as she was feeling a little strange, the knife had already cut off the small piece of beef. She subconsciously put it into her mouth with a fork. The moment the slightly burnt piece of beef entered her mouth, the thick taste of beef juice spread in her mouth. As she gently bit down with her teeth, the elastic feeling of the muscle fibers being bitten off instantly, the thick beef juice hidden in the piece of meat, and the oily feeling of the marble flowers piled up by the fat instantly exploded at this moment. Her jaw moved almost uncontrollably, constantly chewing that piece of beef in her mouth. Excellent, absolutely excellent grade A beef. While her mouth was constantly tasting this delicious food, her brain was also constantly telling her that this thing was real. The taste of this thing was real. Jiang Hai did not lie to her. Or it could be said that he was not deceived. He really did have a special grade A beef cow. At this time, she finally understood why Jiang Hai would be so arrogant as to make a bet with the people from the Cartwright Company. Really, in front of a special grade A beef cow. Unless it was the top Japanese beef cow, all other beef cows would only have the fate of being blown to pieces. The original hesitation about the color, fragrance, and taste had been thrown to the back of her mind at this time. When she finally reacted, the large piece of steak in front of her had already entered her stomach. At this moment, when she looked at the plate of burnt beef again, she felt that it was no longer a plate of beef, but a plate of dollars. She subconsciously picked up the fork, put another piece on her plate, and then began to eat. You'll get tired of eating beef all the time. Come, have some lobster. If you like it, you can take some back later. Just when she was trying her best to eat the second piece of steak in front of her, a huge lobster claw stretched in front of her, and then Jiang Hai's voice came from the opposite side. Sh20 Clive looked up and saw Jiang Hai gnawing on a claw. In fact, whether it was eating crabs or lobsters, they all had their own tools. But Jiang Hai didn't have the patience and leisure to do so. He ate these things violently. Anyway, he had plenty of strength. As for eating elegantly, it had nothing to do with him. She looked up and smiled at Jiang Hai a little embarrassedly, then took the claw from him. Only now did she remember that she looked a little ugly when she was eating the steak. After all, she was a girl, so she couldn't help but feel a little embarrassed. She lowered her head and bit a piece of the claw that Jiang Hai handed to her. Fortunately, Jiang Hai had already pried the claw open. You don't have to take it away. Your steak is really delicious. No wonder you have the confidence to make a bet with Cartwright Company. You know, as long as 1% of the meat produced by your cattle is this grade of beef, you won't have to worry about the sales of your beef cattle. Hearing Jiang Hai's words, SH-20 Clive temporarily got rid of the awkwardness and said seriously to Jiang Hai, 1%? Haha, it's okay. You can eat as much of this beef as you want. If you can't finish it, you can take it all away. I have a lot of fresh beef of this grade here. No one eats the finished ones, so I basically fed it to the dogs. But obviously, they prefer to eat it raw. Shrugging his shoulders, although his words were somewhat hurtful, Jiang Hai was indeed telling the truth. Chapter 137. Let's do it here, good night. The F-650 roared as it stopped in front of a house in Winthrop Town. SH-20 Clive jumped out of the car. Naturally, this time, Jiang Hai also jumped out of the car. Looking at the beautiful girl carrying 2 bags of beef, Jiang Hai couldn't help but hesitate. But Sandy was much more straightforward. Oh, okay, if you want to eat beef or fish, you can come to my place, I have enough. Hearing Sandy's words, Jiang Hai chuckled and said to her. Hearing Jiang Hai's words, Sandy smiled even more happily. She now couldn't understand Jiang Hai, this big boy. Speaking of which, Jiang Hai's age should be about the same as hers. But his shy personality didn't seem like a 27-year-old adult. If SH-20 Clive didn't see his appearance, she would even think that he was just a 17-year-old young man. Sometimes, his thoughts and actions didn't seem like an adult's actions. Jiang Hai could swear that he was indeed an adult, but in terms of mentality, he was indeed a little immature. But there was no other way. In fact, in China, nearly 70% of people as old as Jiang Hai didn't match their age. They were a lot younger. They didn't know how to take care of others when they went out, and they had some unrealistic dreams. They didn't calculate how much money they spent, and they did things based more on hot-bloodedness, etc. Those who had such characteristics could be said to be people who hadn't grown up. Originally, Jiang Hai should have had an opportunity to become stronger, and that was his parents' death. At that time, if he was alone, maybe he would have become more mature. But the appearance of his wife made him fall into a fantasy. But now, although the fantasy was shattered, it wasn't easy for his character to become more mature. If he wanted to become more mature, he had to take a blow. But in the current situation, what blow could he take? He didn't play with investment and financial management, he only played with business. He didn't have any rich friends. Were you sure he would be afraid of fighting and kidnapping? A person like him who couldn't even jump badges and stayed at home all day long. How could he take a blow? But this kind of character was a good character for others. For example, SH-20 Clive. For her, it was good to make friends with such a person. First of all, Jiang Hai wouldn't cheat her, right? As for the future, she would think about it. At least for now. She didn't think that she would have any development with Jiang Hai. After all, from the first time they met until now, they had only met 4 times. Even if the United States was a more open country, it wouldn't be so fast. Well, then I'll go first. Hearing Jiang Hai's promise, SH-20 Clive chuckled, then waved to Jiang Hai, turned around, and walked into the villa behind her. But as soon as she entered the door, she found that in the living room, 3 pairs of eyes were looking at her. Feeling such gazes, SH-20 Clive waved her hand a little awkwardly. You guys haven't slept yet. Looking at the 3 people in front of her, SH-20 Clive broke the silence first. I'll take the things to the kitchen first, you guys talk first. Hearing his daughter's words, SH-20 Clive's father, old Clive, stood up first. It wasn't appropriate for him to say this kind of thing. Although his wife wasn't Sandy's biological mother, the mother and daughter got along well over the years, so it was better for them to ask about this matter. Well, okay. After handing the bag inside to her father, SH-20 Clive hung the coat on the hanger by the door. Compared with Jiang Hai's home, which was 24 degrees all year round, Sandy's home was much colder, only 12 or 13 degrees. After taking off the coat, it was a little cold, but fortunately, she was used to it. Knowing that this matter couldn't be avoided, she took the initiative to go to the sofa in the guest room, picked up the TV, and changed the channel. Sister, did you go out with that guy all day today? Oh, cake seller, did you go to the hotel? When SH20 Clive sat down, her sister Karma Cliff, who had met Jung Hai once, asked excitedly. Hearing her words, Sandy couldn't help but roll her eyes. Are high school students nowadays so direct? How is it possible? I just took him around Boston. He has been here for so long, but he hasn't visited Boston yet. I'm a tour guide today, a tour guide. Rolling her eyes at her little sister, SH20 Clive explained. Hey, how is it possible? How can there be a tour guide as beautiful as sister? Did he touch you? You came back so late. What did you do? Hearing SH20 Clive's words, Karma Cliff obviously didn't believe it and kept asking. You are really gossipy. You are so imaginative. Why don't you write novels? Looking at her sister with some amusement, SH20 Clive said to her angrily. Hearing SH20 Clive's words, Karma couldn't help but hesitate. Was she wrong? But looking at her sister's appearance, such a beautiful woman, she doesn't believe that Jiang Hai won't be tempted. Well, Karma, don't bother your sister, Sandy. Although I am not your biological mother, I have been teaching you as my own daughter over the years. Now you are an adult, and you are not young. You are 26 years old this year. If you really meet the right one, you should consider it. I think the young man just now is good. I heard from Karma that his economic conditions are also very good. Although our family doesn't want his money, this is basic. If you have feelings for him, you can try and give him some opportunities. Patting Karma's thigh, Xanthi's stepmother looked at Xanthi and said seriously, there was a good saying, if there was a stepmother, there would be a stepfather. In this world there were many vicious stepmothers. However, Sandy's fate is good. Her stepmother is still very good to her, and she and Karma are 9 years apart. So when she was almost sensible, Karma was born. The age gap between the two is a lot, and the things needed at each age are different. This may also be the reason why there are no other contradictions in this family. Mom, you really think too much. I really only met him 4 times. If he hadn't donated $60,000 to our school to build the school building, I wouldn't have accompanied him to Boston. Looking at her mother with a dumbfounded expression, SH20 Clive said clearly, but at the same time, Jiang Hai's figure kept appearing in her mind today. From the silly boy who got up in the morning, to the confident man in the afternoon, to the master who fought with more than a dozen people in order to retrieve his wallet at night, and the beef at night. It's really hard to say what she feels about Jiang Hai, but now she can be sure that she has some good feelings about him. But that is only limited to friends. But then again, she seems to have forgotten something. It seems to be beef. Yes, beef. Just as she was recalling what happened today, a scream came from the kitchen in the distance. When the mother and daughters heard this scream, they immediately thought that something bad had happened and quickly ran to the kitchen. But when they arrived in the kitchen, they found that their father and husband were holding their big bald heads with both hands, looking at the beef in the plastic bag in front of them with horror. Yes, although Jiang Hai's words were a bit annoying, but as the daughter of a chef, Sandy couldn't watch this good meat fall into the dog's mouth. So in the end, she took the rest of the beef away. Little Yellow and Xiaobai didn't say anything about this. Just like what Jiang Hai said, these two guys prefer to eat raw, not cooked. And it seems that they have become more and more wild recently. But for Jiang Hai, this beef that dogs don't like to eat is a supreme delicacy in the eyes of humans. Super A, top-grade frost snow beef. It's actually made like this. This is unforgivable. Looking at the leftover steaks in front of him, Sandy's father picked up a piece and said with a sad face, which made him feel even more distressed than cutting off a piece of his meat. It's not necessary, Dad, you're too evil. Isn't it just beef? Hearing her father's roar, Karma, who didn't know much about this, scratched her head strangely. Not long after she could remember, Sandy's father had stopped cooking in the Western restaurant. So even if she had tasted top-grade beef when she was young, she wouldn't remember. In her opinion, All beef was about the same. It's not that bad. How can you say it's not that bad? This state, and this distribution of fat, is clearly something that only top-grade frost beef can have. I still remember seeing this kind of beef in a Japanese restaurant a long time ago. At that time, I was also shocked. The distribution of fat on the meat was like a beautiful picture scroll. It was mesmerizing. Do you know how much this kind of beef can be sold for in New York? $400 a pound. But what are you making now? This is simply a crime, a reckless waste of God's gift. Hearing his daughter's words, Clive almost jumped up in anger. Grabbing the steak in his hand, he said with an intoxicated look. Hearing his words, his wife and Carmacliff were both stunned. How could a piece of beef be so expensive? It's okay. This is just what we're eating tonight. There's another piece beside it that he gave me. It hasn't been cooked yet. Hearing her father's words, Sh20 Clive muttered in her heart. As I guessed, this is indeed a top-grade steak. It's just that Mrs. Turner ruined it. Thinking of this, she immediately told her father that she had brought a piece of raw steak. Chapter 138. Ignoring Sh20 Clive's father. Jiang Hai watched Sh20 Clive walk into their house before he drove back to his manor. Superior A-grade beef was actually not just superior A-grade beef. It was more of a noble attitude. Those who could afford to eat this kind of food were all rich people. It was more of a symbol of status than the price of the ingredients themselves. For example, even if this premium snowflake beef was sold for $400 a pound, would the people in the United States not be able to afford it? They definitely could not afford to eat it every day. But what about a month or a year? They would definitely be willing to pay for it. The problem was that this type of beef was priceless. It could not be bought on the market. The beef sold in the largest supermarket was only of the best quality. There wasn't even a special selection, let alone a special quality one. If the supermarkets did not have it, one could not expect to find it in the market. There was only one source of this type of beef. It was a premium Western restaurant. Normally, this type of beef would cost more than $300. $400 was less than 1 pound. However, if one went to a Western restaurant, the price would be terrifying. Moreover, one would not just order a plate of steak at a Western restaurant. The cheapest 3-course set meal with premium A snowflake beef, as the main course, would cost $998. If one person ate $998, 2 people would cost at least $2,000. Not many people would be willing to eat this kind of food. However, for Jiang Hai, this meat was just meat. Other people's cows were carefully raised, and their marbled meat would not yield more than 5% of the meat. However, Jiang Hai's cows could yield 10% of the meat. This was what it meant to be a cow with 13 points. Although he had to bleed himself every time, Jiang Hai felt that it was worth it. The scales are almost full. I hope I won't need to bleed again in the next level. After returning home, Jiang Hai took a shower and looked at the python tattoo on his body in the mirror. At this time, the scales on the python's body were almost fully grown. After all, Jiang Hai did not bleed during the winter. 8 scales were growing every day, so the scales on his python were almost fully grown. Now only a small part of the tail was left. He did not know what would happen after the evolution, but Jiang Hai was still looking forward to it. The next morning, Jiang Hai woke up and went out for a run. Then he went out to sea with Robbins and the others. Naturally, Jiang Hai didn't recruit these sailors to feed the uncles. They needed to work. Jiang Hai's order for the sea bath seeds should be delivered in the middle of January, which is around the 15th or 16th. Before these seeds were released, Jiang Hai needed to catch most of the fish in the area where he wanted to raise fish and sell them. This was to give space for the fish raised later. After all, the fish here were too mixed. Some of them were valuable, and some were not. After fishing them up, it was not necessarily profitable. Secondly, if these fish were not caught, the seeds of the sea bath would become their food. The seeds of the sea bath were actually secondary. After all, they were not expensive. But if Jiang Hai's fry became their food, then Jiang Hai would cry. Of course, it was not to catch all the fish in this sea area. Jiang Hai was not going to catch any fish near the coastal coral reefs, because the fish near the coral reefs had their own set of food chains. Jiang Hai did not need to worry about them. More importantly, many of these fish relied on the coral reefs to survive, such as some low-level bream, shrimps, crabs, and so on. It was precisely because of the existence of these prey that some predatory fish would not leave this area. Jiang Hai did not need to worry that these fish would affect Jiang Hai's fish farm. As for the fish in the sea outside, Jiang Hai did not plan to catch all of them. He only wanted to catch 80% of them. Even if he ate the rest, he would not be able to eat much. But even if it was 80%, it was still a small amount. According to Robin's measurements, the total number of fish in Jiang Hai's fishery might be worth tens of millions of dollars. Of course, if Jiang Hai didn't touch the corals now, it would be at least $4 million less. But there were $6 million worth of fish left. Even if it was 80%, it was still $8 million worth of fish. There were a lot of fish. Just like a few days ago, when Jiang Hai went out to sea, a large number of fish were found at the bottom of the sea in less than half an hour. What else was there to say? Let's start fishing. With a new helper, Philip didn't need to come and cause trouble. These old fishermen were much faster than Jiang Hai and Philip. In less than half an hour, they had already finished sorting the fish that weighed several tons. The only thing Jiang Hai needed to do as the boss was to count the kilograms of high-quality fish, ordinary fish, and things like shrimps and crabs. However, some of these shrimps and crabs would not be sold, because Jiang Hai liked to eat them. Perhaps some people would say that this was not good. They would have to be sold. Wasn't Jiang Hai in need of money now? Every penny should be split into two halves. However, the so-called lack of money was just that. At the very least, Jiang Hai would not mistreat himself in terms of living. Besides, he believed that his money would come back sooner or later. As long as he paid the first year's taxes, Jiang Hai believed that his cow would give him a satisfactory answer for the second year's taxes. Today the fishing boat went out for a spin. In half a day, the 4 warehouses of the fishing boat were filled with fish. Jiang Hai was forced to go to the fisherman's place. The 4 warehouses of fish earned Jiang Hai $60,000. In the afternoon, he went to fish a few more nets. Before the market closed at night, Jiang Hai's 4 cabins were full again, and he sold them for another $65,000. His daily income was $125,000. After deducting the cost of diesel and lunch, Jiang Hai's net income was about $100,000. Of course, the fish were originally his, but he had to give them a bonus. After all, this was Jiang Hai's first time working with these sailors, so he gave them a generous bonus. He gave them a bonus of $10,000, which was equivalent to 10% of the net income. Divided equally among the 5 fishermen, each of them received $2,000. The fishermen were overjoyed. Not only were Eleanor Lucy and Andrew Christian so happy that their mouths were about to form a circle, but even Tommy Charles and Marlon Rupert were very happy. Although they were white, it was the first time they had seen a boss who gave out money so readily. At the same time, they had more confidence in Jiang Hai. When Jiang Hai's fishing boat returned to the port, the fishermen delivered some of the seafood that Jiang Hai deliberately left behind to Jiang Hai's home, and then dispersed. But just as these people left, while Jiang Hai was still dealing with these things, someone outside the door rang the doorbell. Jiang Hai went to take a look. It was none other than his chief lawyer, Moses Adams. Mr. Jiang Hai, I brought the preliminary handling of last night's incident. Hearing Jiang Hai's voice, Moses Adams, who was standing outside the door, immediately said with a smile. He knew that these rich people had bad tempers, and it was unacceptable that their private lawyers were not there when they were in trouble. After all, they had to pay. So when Moses Adams learned that Jiang Hai was looking for him, he flew over overnight. After sleeping on the plane, he began to deal with and ask about the process of Jiang Hai's incident. Although it was a little thrilling, it was relatively clear. So today, he had already brought the preliminary handling opinions. Of course, whether to deal with it or not was up to Jiang Hai. After all, he was only a lawyer, not the client. He could not make any decisions for the client. Come in. Although Jiang Hai was somewhat dissatisfied that this person was not there when he was in trouble yesterday, he still pressed the doorbell and let him in. Hearing Jiang Hai's words, Moses Adams couldn't help but let out a sigh of relief. Then he drove into Jiang Hai's manor. After parking the car, he walked into Jiang Hai's villa with a file bag. But as soon as he entered the villa, he smelled a fishy smell. Just as he was about to speak, he saw Xiao Bai and Xiao Huang flash out from the side in an instant, looking at him with a wary face. As long as he dared to take a step forward, the eyes of the two big dogs instantly changed from wary to threatening. And looking at their eyes, Moses Adams was sure that if he dared to take a step forward, they would pounce on him. Looking at the two dogs that were bigger than wolves, Moses Adams subconsciously swallowed a mouthful of saliva. Mr. Jiang Hai, I'm here. After thinking about it, Moses Adams wisely chose not to move, but shouted into the villa. Hearing his shout, after about a minute or so, Jiang Hai walked out of the warehouse in the distance with his clothes on. When he saw him, Jiang Hai's face showed a hint of surprise. You're here. Hey, these two guys won't let outsiders in before they get the order. Xiao Bai, Xiao Huang, go back to your nest. Looking at Moses Adams, Jiang Hai chuckled and said to him, then motioned to Xiao Bai and Xiao Huang to leave. After hearing Jiang Hai's words, Moses Adams couldn't help but flash a bitter smile. How could he not know that this was Jiang Hai's way of putting him in his place? Just now, the door was opened by Jiang Hai, and now Jiang Hai said that he didn't know he was here. How is that possible? This was Jiang Hai expressing his dissatisfaction, that he didn't come immediately after he called him yesterday. It's understandable. If it were me, I would probably be very dissatisfied too. Boss, I don't want to explain too much, but I brought you a gift. Look. Chapter 139. What? Hearing his words, Jiang Hai couldn't help but smile. It seemed that Moses Adams was a person who understood people's hearts very well. To put it bluntly, Jiang Hai was a person with a tough mouth, but a soft heart. In fact, more often than not, as long as he gave in and paid a price, he could get away with it. After all, he was just a nouveau riche, not a noble who valued face more than anything else. Now that he heard that Moses Adams had brought him something, he looked at it curiously. Here. Seeing Jiang Hai's expression, Moses Adams also showed a kind smile. He knew that he had passed this time. Then he handed Jiang Hai an envelope. Jiang Hai took the envelope and glanced at it. He knew what was inside. It should be the tickets for the 2015 NBA All-Star Game, because the outside of the envelope was printed with the promotional poster for the 2015 NBA All-Star Game. Although he already guessed what was inside, Jiang Hai was still very happy to open the envelope. After opening the envelope, he found a magnetic card inside. This is the NBA All-Star Game ticket package. It includes the open practice for the All-Star Game on the 13th, the Masters Game and Rookie Challenge on the 14th, the All-Star Weekend Challenge on the 15th, the Development League All-Star Game on the 16th, the concert before the All-Star Game, and all the tickets for the All-Star Game. My seat is in the first row of the Eastern All-Star Game. If it wasn't held in New York this time, I wouldn't have been able to get such a good seat, but it really took a lot of effort to get it. Looking at Jiang Hai, Moses Adams said with a smile. Hearing his words, Jiang Hai curled his lips. He knew that Moya Adams was exaggerating, but he really liked this thing. I won't pretend that yesterday didn't happen. Next time, Mr. Adams, if I can't find you and have to wait 23 hours before I see you, then you can say goodbye to my dollar forever. Although this gift was very thoughtful, Jiang Hai still decided to give him a warning and let him know that he was not a pushover. That's what I should do. It was my mistake this time. Moses Adams quickly nodded when he heard that Jiang Hai had decided to turn the page. Sometimes it wasn't a big deal to admit a mistake. After all, nobody would make life difficult for a green dollar. Tell me about this incident. Leaning back on the sofa, Jiang Hai asked Moses Adams. Looking at Jiang Hai, Moses Adams slowly said, this time, to be honest, you won't get any benefits, because these people really don't have anything. The nature of this incident was determined very quickly. It was very clear that Jiang Hai had been attacked. The police had indeed found Scheich Clive's wallet on the thief's body, and they had also found the fingerprints of these people on the switchblade on the floor. Moreover, it wasn't the first time these people had done something like this. Although they were really pitiful, as Jiang Hai said, this wasn't the reason for their crimes. These people were basically people with physical disabilities. America's society was essentially a capitalist society. Therefore, although there were some welfare organizations that would accept such people, their lives in the welfare organizations were not very good. After all, it cost a lot of money to raise a person, and everything in a capitalist society required money. Even the air they breathed had to be taxed. Under such circumstances, it would be strange if their lives were good. So from a young age, they learned the law of the jungle in the welfare agency. The stronger, the more ruthless, they could eat more. The thin and weak, if they didn't do anything, they couldn't even fill their stomachs. Moreover, the most important thing was that the welfare agency couldn't take care of them for a lifetime. When they reached adulthood, the welfare agency would ask them to do some things, and they would accept the food and accommodation provided by the welfare agency in return. Many people couldn't accept this, and they were more willing to leave the welfare agency. But when they were young, they put more energy into how to fill their stomachs. In addition to their congenital deficiencies, it was difficult for them to find a job after entering society, and they didn't have a clear position. Over time, in these big cities, they were led astray by society and formed their own culture. When the men grew up, they became thieves and robbers. Of course, their main business was pimping. When the women grew up, they had no other choice but to sell their bodies to make a living. Speaking of which, this was a group of pitiful people. Even Jiang Hai felt quite uncomfortable when he heard it. He felt like he wasn't a good person, but when this feeling rose, Jiang Hai shook his head. What kind of Virgin Mary plot was the most unacceptable? Forget it, I won't sue them. After thinking for a while, Jiang Hai shook his head and let these guys go. My boss is really a kind guy. Hearing Jiang Hai's words, Moshe Adams also said with a smile, well, some people with criminal cases will be locked up, and some who didn't commit any crimes will be educated in the police station for a few days at most, and then sent back to the welfare agency. They may also be dismissed on the spot. Hearing Jiang Hai's words, Moshe Adams thought for a while. According to the local laws of Boston, the situation was basically like this. After listening to Moshe Adams's words, Jiang Hai asked carefully. This time, a total of 36 people were caught in the den. 13 of the men, the 13 people who were killed by Jiang Hai, had crimes on them. Robbery, car theft, they all had criminal records. This time they were in prison. It was estimated that they wouldn't be able to come out for a few years. There were also 23 women. Basically, they would not be punished too severely. It was the same as the law in Huaxia. Being a special service person did not constitute a crime. After the general den in China was raided, except for the organizer who would be sentenced, the people below would not be sentenced. At most, they would be locked up for 15 days and pay a fine of 5,000 yuan. The situation in the United States was similar. At most, they would be dismissed from the state. If you want to do it, you can go to other states to do it. After all, there were many states in the United States that were very open to this kind of thing and had licenses. However, after Jiang Hai heard this, he was a little uncomfortable. It was not that he thought the punishment was light. It was because he felt that if these people were released, they would probably do what they originally did. After all, they had no other way to survive. Those men dared to attack him, so he just ignored them. However, those women were a little pitiful. He remembered how bad the environment was after he chased them to the alley yesterday. Those women's eyes were so numb and lifeless when they looked at him. If he didn't know about this, it would be just that. But now that he knew, he still felt a little sorry if he didn't do anything. But what can he do? He didn't know himself, but fortunately, there were still 15 days to think about it. Those women are going to be locked up for 15 days, right? Looking at Moses Adams, Jiang Hai asked him. 21 of them are. But there are 2 twin sisters. They may not be, because the elder sister is the one who stole your wallet. It seems that there are no other cases except for this case. The younger sister has no criminal record, so the police are now waiting for your answer. If you want to pursue the matter, you will arrest the elder sister. If you don't pursue the matter, they may be released directly." Hearing Jiang Hai's words, Moses, Adams thought for a moment and said, "Sisters, let's go and have a look." Hearing his words, Jiang Hai's brows couldn't help but raise. He didn't expect that the thief he caught yesterday turned out to be a girl. Thinking about how he felt when he searched the wallet yesterday, but the girl was really too thin, almost like a bag of bones. Jiang Hai almost searched her upper body, but he didn't find that she was a woman. Suddenly, Jiang Hai wanted to see these people, because he still couldn't make up his mind about what to do. "Okay." Hearing Jiang Hai's words, Moses, Adams on the other side immediately responded. After Jiang Hai changed his clothes and suppressed the fishy smell, the two drove into the city of Boston, one in front and one behind. Soon they came to the police station where Jiang Hai came yesterday. Originally, he was very reluctant to come back, but now he had something on his mind, so he didn't think much and went straight in. Fortunately, the police here still remembered him. After hearing Moses, Adams explained Jiang Hai's intention. They took Jiang Hai to the small cell in the police station. Although this was not a detention center, after all, the prisoners were caught in the police station. It was impossible to let the prisoners run around in the police station, especially a large number of prisoners. They still needed a place to temporarily hold them, and it was such a small cell. However, this small cell was much better than the cells in the prison. At least, they would not be treated unfairly. When Jiang Hai walked in, 3 of the 6 cells were full. One of them was holding the 13 people defeated by Jiang Hai yesterday. Some of them needed treatment and were still in the hospital. The rest didn't need treatment or had already been treated. When Jiang Hai came in, these people raised their heads and looked at Jiang Hai. But at this time, there was only resentment and a strong murderous intent in their eyes. After all, it was because of this man that they didn't get the money, were caught, and were beaten. If eyes could kill, Jiang Hai would have died thousands of times. Originally, Jiang Hai still had some pity for these people, but when he saw the eyes of these men, Jiang Hai's heart calmed down. He knew that these people were no different from normal prisoners. Maybe their starting point was different, but the result was the same. Even if he used his connections to release these people now, these people would not be grateful in their hearts. Instead, they would look for opportunities to retaliate against him, or go out and resume their old business, causing more innocent people to suffer. They were not wronged at all. Chapter 140. Clang. Just as Jiang Hai walked past the male prisoner's cell, a girl suddenly jumped out of another cell next to it. The girl's hands slammed heavily on the iron bars of the cell. The loud noise also attracted Jiang Hai's attention. The girl looked about 1.6 meters tall, with short brown hair and a small face, about the size of a palm. Her light blue eyes were very beautiful, but from the shape of her face, it could be seen that she was too thin. At the same time, the clothes she was wearing were also somewhat familiar to Jiang Hai. If there was no accident, this girl should be the thief he caught. After seeing Jiang Hai looking over, the girl quickly used her hands to say something to Jiang Hai, but unfortunately, Jiang Hai didn't learn sign language, so he didn't know what the girl was saying. I don't understand what you mean." Seeing the girl getting more and more excited, Jiang Hai said helplessly. She said that she knows she was wrong. She is willing to atone for her mistakes, but please save her sister. She didn't do anything bad. At this time, the policeman who led Jiang Hai and the others and said slowly, "You can read sign language?" Hearing the policeman's words, Jiang Hai asked him strangely, "I used to be a volunteer." Seeing Jiang Hai so surprised, the fat policeman shrugged and said softly. Hearing the fat policeman's words, Jiang Hai turned his head and looked at the 2 cells in front of him. In these 2 cells the girls were imprisoned. Different from the original alley, their clothes were cleaner. On each of their delicate faces, there was a pale and numb expression. Except for this girl, and a girl standing not far behind her, who looked very similar to her. No one had any emotional fluctuations because of Jiang Hai's arrival. Perhaps for them, being alive might be more liberating than being dead. But human nature made them still struggle to live in this evil world. Jiang Hai was just one of the passers-by in their lives, and didn't mean anything. Sigh, I originally didn't want to do anything to you. Those fellows deserved to be punished. As for you, you are all pitiful people. I came back this time to ask you, what are your plans after you come out? Seeing the expressions on these people's faces, Jiang Hai felt as if his heart had been punched. What kind of experience did they have to go through to have such despair? Jiang Hai used to think that when his parents left, he was the loneliest and most pitiful person in the world. But suddenly, he found that his most difficult days seemed to be far from the daily lives of these people. Although he was not a saint, at this moment, he hesitated and scratched his head. It seemed that he was regarded as a villain. However, it didn't matter if he was a villain, as long as he didn't do anything that made him unhappy. Hearing Jiang Hai's words, the girl, who was still gesturing quickly, couldn't help but stop for a moment. Then, she looked at Jiang Hai with some hesitation. Future? For them, the word future was illusory and unrealistic. How could they be qualified to talk about the future? Because they didn't know what would happen today. Would they starve to death? Would they be killed by others? Towards this world, this society, now they had almost fallen into despair. Perhaps their lives would be like this day by day. They would be locked up here for 15 days. And then when they were released, they would go back to their old jobs. After all, this was the only thing they knew. Now that they heard Jiang Hai's words, the girls here were a little confused. Listen, if I want to help you, then do you want to go back to the orphanage, find a job, or don't need me to care about you? Looking at the women in front of him, to be exact, they were girls because these women were not very old. Jiang Hai had read their information before coming in. Among these women, the oldest was only 22 years old, but she had already lived there for 6 years. That kind of environment would have a great impact on people's lifespan. The oldest in this group was the leader of the 13 men. He was also a deaf and mute person. He was 31 years old this year. Although he wasn't very old, he had already lived in that place for 17 years. Before these people, there were many groups of people in that place, but it was very difficult for them to live past 25 years old. Among these women, the oldest was 22 years old, and the youngest was only 14 years old. They were the twins. Maybe it was because the twin sister was a thief, or maybe it was because they were still young, so they hadn't sold their bodies yet. However, this was only temporary. In a few years, they would also follow this old path. Now that they suddenly heard Jiang Hai's words, the people here were stunned. Many of them couldn't help but raise their heads and look at Jiang Hai. They wanted to know whether Jiang Hai was telling the truth or not. This could be seen from their eyes. Boss, are you serious? When these women raised their heads and looked at Jiang Hai, Moses Adams, who was behind Jiang Hai, also stood up and asked hesitantly. After all, these women's identities were not so clean. Well, I'm serious. In my manor, there is a winery that will start planting grapes this year. I think they will be good winemakers. Hearing Moses Adams' words, Jiang Hai shrugged. Originally, he didn't decide whether to help these people or not. But when he saw the numbness of these people, he decided to lend a helping hand. If that's the case, I won't say much. Boss, although I'm very grateful to you, it's easy to hire them. But it's not so easy to change them. But there is also an advantage, which is that they can help you avoid taxes. Hearing that Jiang Hai even arranged a place for them, Moses Adams couldn't help but hesitate for a moment, then sighed and said, "It's not easy to change them, it's quite troublesome. One must know that these women's identities are very special. Ordinary manners want to hire them only to avoid taxes. And hiring 1 or 2 is enough. But how many does Jiang Hai want to hire?" He believed that if Jiang Hai said this sentence, at least 10 of these women would be willing to work. 10 deaf and mute girls, and deaf and mute girls who used to be professional women. By then, it would be more than just a little troublesome. It's estimated that those welfare agencies and the like would run to Jiang Hai every 2 or 3 days, to see if they were abused, to see if they were not allowed to eat well, to dress well, to see if the work was heavy, to see if they were discriminated against, to see if they would make some unreasonable requests, etc. When these people were about to starve, no one was willing to pay attention to them. But when someone stretched out a helping hand, there were often some defenders who would stand up and nitpick at the bones in an egg. I don't care about that. I just want to help you. Let me tell you, although this matter is more or less related to you, I don't want to mention it again. Now, I'll help to provide a position in the winery. I'm not very clear about the specific work, because I don't know how to make wine. But I guess you'll just have to take care of the grapes and pick them after the season. I won't give you a small amount of money because of your relationship with the people outside. Money is equal to the people outside. Food, accommodation, and food will be beef and fish, because there are also cattle and fish in my manor. The place you will live in will be a standalone villa, but you may need to squeeze in and sleep in the villa. If you don't want to, and want to go back to the orphanage, I will ask someone to send you back. If you don't need my help, I can also bail you out. But once you're out of the door, it has nothing to do with me. Looking at these women in front of him, Jiang Hai said seriously. Hearing Jiang Hai's words, some people who were still doubtful, or even completely numb, suddenly became interested in Jiang Hai's proposal. Of course, there were still many people who were still numb, such as the oldest woman. At this time, she was still looking at the roof, without a trace of anger. If it weren't for the fact that her chest was still moving up and down, proving that she was still alive, she would be no different from a corpse. Obviously, this woman had no hope for life at this time. This was not something that Jiang Hai could change with a few words. All right, let's bail them all out. The words that needed to be said had been said, and Jiang Hai did not want to say any more nonsense. He had already done his duty. After getting up, he said to Moses Adams, "Let's go." In response to Jiang Hai's words, Moses Adams shrugged, although he did not think that Jiang Hai had made a clear choice. But Jiang Hai was the boss, and he had the final say. These women did not have any criminal records, so they only needed to pay some money, and they could leave. Although Jiang Hai lacked money, he did not lack this. The 23 women were sold for a total of $11,000. That was equivalent to $500 per person. And the twin sister, who did not commit any crime, did not need to pay. When all the formalities were done, Jiang Hai also left the police station with the 23 women. When they left, the 13 men on the other side kept reaching out, wanting to grab Jiang Hai, or begging him to take them away. Unfortunately, Jiang Hai did not even look at them. After leaving the police station, 8 of the 23 women left alone. This was what Jiang Hai said. He would not restrict their freedom. They did not believe in Jiang Hai, and it could be said that they did not believe in this society and this world. So when they left, Jiang Hai did not try to persuade them to stay. This was not something that could be changed with just a few words. There were 15 women left, including the twins. Those under the age of 18 should go back to the orphanage. If you don't want to go back to your original orphanage, Adams will help them contact the orphanage in Boston. I will pay for the intermediate costs. Looking at the remaining 15 people, Jiang Hai hesitated and said. Chapter 141. As soon as they heard that they were going to be sent back to the orphanage, several of the remaining girls began to shake their heads immediately. Looking at their frightened faces, Jiang Hai was a little confused. What's going on? Unfortunately, he couldn't understand what the girls were gesturing. So after hesitating for a while, he went to the police station and caught the fat policeman. He asked him to act as a translator. After the policeman saw the girls' gestures, he explained to Jiang Hai. They said that they don't want to go back to the orphanage. They are not happy there. They don't have enough to eat every day. Who the hell those damn orphanages? Under the policeman's explanation, Jiang Hai slowly understood. In fact, although it was called an orphanage, this thing was really not as beautiful as the movies and TV dramas. Although the orphanage was not for profit, they also needed to spend money. The food they ate was not grown by the wind. The water they used also needed money. The electricity they used also needed money. Quilts, beds, and other things also needed money. Even if the government had subsidies, it was just a drop in the bucket. Therefore, under such circumstances, the children in the orphanage were actually not very good. Some of the younger children were still fine. Other than reading the Bible every day and not having enough to eat, they basically did not need to do any physical work. As for what to eat, there was no need to think about it. Basically, the food they ate every day was mainly mud of various vegetables. It was good enough to not starve to death. The older children not only had to read the Bible every day, but also had to use their own hands to exchange for food because they ate more. It was natural for them to do odd jobs in the orphanage, so there was no need to say much about it. In addition, they also needed to make some small biscuits, small food, and so on. They went to the parking lots, squares, or outside their homes in the rich district to sell these things. The money they sold back did not belong to them, but they had to hand it over. At the same time, everyone had their own business target every month. If they didn't achieve it, although they wouldn't be punished, they would have to eat less and be locked up in a small dark room. It was a common occurrence. Normal welfare institutions were like this. Not to mention the abnormal welfare institute these children were staying in. In such a welfare institute, people were more violent and irritated. Otherwise, they would not be willing to leave a place where they could at least sleep. Now that they heard that Jiang Hai wanted to send them back, they quickly shook their heads. They didn't want to go back. I can't do anything if you don't want to go back. I can't hire underage people to come to my manor. It's against the law. Although Jiang Hai was not afraid of the law, it did not mean that he would take the initiative to break the law. No matter where he was, hiring child labor was going to jail. Upon hearing Jiang Hai's words, the girls stopped and lowered their heads helplessly. Among the 15 girls, the oldest was 21 years old, and the youngest was the pair of 14-year-old twins. 8 of them were over 18 years old, and 7 of them were underage. 3 of them were 17 years old, 2 of them were 16 years old, and this pair of 14-year-old twins. How about this? You go back to the Welfare Institute first. When you are 18 years old, you can come to me again. I will definitely hire you. Looking at the girls' gloomy expressions, Jiang Hai scratched his head and promised the girls. Hearing Jiang Hai's words, the 5 older girls among the girls looked at each other, hesitated, and nodded weakly. Seeing that the girls agreed, Jiang Hai was relieved. He immediately called Adams to open a hotel nearby for the girls. Then he contacted the best orphanage in the Boston area. Tomorrow, the 7 girls will be sent to the orphanage. However, after entering the hotel, Jiang Hai booked a room for them and was about to leave. However, these girls would not let Jiang Hai leave. After all, their lives had just been rekindled with a glimmer of hope. If Jiang Hai left like this, what would they do? How would they know if Jiang Hai was lying to them? Looking at these girls who blocked his way and frantically said something in sign language. Although Jiang Hai did not understand, he knew what they meant. In the end, Jiang Hai had no choice but to open a room in the hotel. Boss, I have to admit that you are a kind-hearted rich man. In fact, in my opinion, even if you are merciful, you can just give them some money. Because he still needs to call the Boston Welfare Institute tonight and sign a labor contract with Jiang Hai tomorrow. These girls are not ordinary people. The labor agreement they sign is not as simple as Robin's. These girls are still quite troublesome, especially when Jiang Hai hires so many girls at once. It is even more troublesome. Give a man a fish, and you feed him for a day. Hey, you don't understand. Do they lack money in that line of work? What they need now is not money, but they need to really integrate into this world and become a member of this society. What they need is respect and a job, not just some money that will be spent. Hey, you don't understand. Have you contacted the Welfare Institute? Hearing Moses Adams's words, Jiang Hai gave him a blank look and said with a serious face, "Almost done. We have already contacted 3 families. They can accept 5 people, but there are still 2 people who are a bit troublesome." Hearing Jiang Hai's words, Moses Adams said with a serious face, "Contact them even if it's troublesome." Hearing what he said, Jiang Hai snorted. Why bother looking for a lawyer? With such a sentence, Jiang Hai went to his room first and Moses Adams also smiled bitterly. If it weren't for Jiang Hai being a high-quality client, he wouldn't have served him. It's too troublesome. For the first time, he heard that a lawyer had to arrange a welfare institute for some orphans. He really didn't take him seriously as a lawyer. But considering that Jiang Hai gave him a lawyer's fee based on time, he sighed again. As long as Jiang Hai gives him money, even if he asks him to pay for him to find a special service person, he has to accompany him, right? So he just shook his head and entered another room opened by Jiang Hai. Because Jiang Hai wanted to save trouble, he booked a room on the first floor of the hotel. 15 girls plus 2 men, 1 room for each. He doesn't need this money. Anyway, it's just one night. It doesn't matter. After Jiang Hai entered the room, he sat on the sofa in the room, turned on the TV, and flipped through the hotel's TV program in boredom. For him, he actually didn't care much about the past of these girls, or the future, or what happened to them. The reason why he did this today was because he didn't want to waste time talking about it. At the same time, it was also because he really had a hidden heart. But what will happen in the future? He didn't want to think about it at the moment, and he wasn't prepared to think about it. If these girls don't work hard, then he will dismiss them without any hesitation. But others don't know. Jiang Hai's sixth sense tells him that these new girls will work hard. What happened later also confirmed Jiang Hai's conjecture. These girls really cherish the opportunity when they have it. Bang bang bang. Just as Jiang Hai was thinking about it, there was a knock on the door. When Jiang Hai heard the knock on the door, he couldn't help but be stunned. Who would knock on his people in the middle of the night? Out of curiosity, he walked to the door and opened it. But when he opened it, he was stunned because the person who knocked on his door was none other than the 14-year-old sister, the girl who stole Shinty Clive's wallet. Oh, what's the matter? Looking at the girl in front of him, Jiang Hai looked at her strangely and asked. Ah. Hearing Jiang Hai's words, the girl began to gesture. She also knew that Jiang Hai couldn't understand sign language, so her gestures were very slow. Sign language, in fact, is a kind of symbolic memory of movements. It is mainly based on association. After Jiang Hai looked at it a few times, he probably guessed it. The girl's words were, "Please don't let them leave." The them he was referring to, if nothing unexpected happened, should be her and her younger sister. Why don't you want to go to the welfare institute? Yes, the life there may not be good, but I contacted the best welfare institute here. It should be better than the one you stayed in before. I promise, as long as you are willing to come to my manor to work after you are 18 years old, I will hire you. Seeing the girl's gesture, Jiang Hai said seriously. But the girl shook her head after listening to Jiang Hai's words. And she kept gesturing just now, which also made Jiang Hai a little overwhelmed. Seeing the hesitant look on Jiang Hai's face, the girl seemed to have made up her mind. She took a step forward and stood in front of Jiang Hai's door. With the force of her hands, she directly took off the tattered cotton-padded clothes she was wearing outside. As soon as the cotton-padded clothes were taken off, Jiang Hai was shocked. This was because at this time, the girl was not wearing any other clothes. She was only wearing a pair of pants, but her upper body was bare. But unlike other women's bodies, Jiang Hai's reaction was different. In addition to surprise and fear, there was also a trace of pity. This was because although the girl was 10 years old, her body was almost undeveloped. From Jiang Hai's perspective, he could clearly see the ribs on her body. This girl was extremely thin. Put it on. What are you doing? Forcibly turning his head, Jiang Hai pulled up the girl's clothes again. But the girl kept on taking them off. Her eyes were fixed on Jiang Hai. She had made up her mind to use her body in exchange for the opportunity to stay. This time, Jiang Hai really did not know what to do. Boss, the last orphanage also replied. Boss, I'm disturbing you. At this time, Moses Adams, who was in the next room, also finished his phone call and walked over to report the news to Jiang Hai. But as soon as he walked over, he saw this scene. Don't say those useless things. It's like this. Hearing his words, Jiang Hai wanted to kick him to death. He glared at him and quickly explained. Hearing Jiang Hai's words, Moses Adams's face was also a little embarrassed. Mr. Jiang, I have no other choice. If you don't want to hire child labor, then you can only adopt them. Chapter 142. Adopt your ass. Which country's law allows a 27-year-old single man to adopt two 14-year-old deaf and mute girls? Hearing Moses, Adams's words, Jiang Hai almost went berserk. If he had salt soda next to him, he would probably spray Moses, Adams to death. What kind of idea is this adopt? Not to mention whether he agrees or not. The law of the United States will not allow it. He now has some doubts about whether Moses, Adams is a lawyer or not. Hearing Moses Adams's words, the girl, who thought it was impossible, couldn't help but raise her head, her eyes full of hope. But when Jiang Hai saw this glimmer of hope, he was a little speechless. If the truth is really as simple as he said. But the problem is, things are not as simple as he said. Jiang Hai doesn't believe that this guy doesn't know what he knows. Hearing Jiang Hai's words, the girl's eyes showed a trace of frustration. She bit her lip gently and didn't speak. She just stared at Jiang Hai with her big eyes, hoping that this matter can still be turned around. No, Mr. Jiang, you got two things wrong. First, you are not single, you are already married. Second, you are a rich man. This may be a bit troublesome for others, but for you, it is not very troublesome. Looking at Jiang Hai, Moses, Adams said with a smile, but looking at his smile, Jiang Hai wanted to beat him so much. I am single, I am divorced. Looking at Moses Adams, Jiang Hai said very clearly, no, you are not. Well, even if you are divorced, why don't you go back first, and then inform the people from the welfare agency to come and deal with this matter. Hearing Jiang Hai's words, Moses Adams was about to say something, but he quickly shut up. He also knew that he said too much. Jiang Hai is obviously unwilling to adopt this pair of sisters, so he seems to have done something wrong with his good intentions. If it was before, he would have woken up long ago. But there is no other way. He hasn't slept for nearly 48 hours. Yesterday morning, he was still in Miami, and only took a nap on the plane. Today he has been running for Jiang Hai, a big client. Now his brain really can't keep up. If it doesn't work, I can only do this. Kid, you heard it. In fact, I am not qualified to let you stay, but if you really don't want to go to the welfare agency, then wait for the people from the welfare agency to come. Then you can talk to them. Looking at the girl beside him, Jiang Hai said slowly. Hearing Jiang Hai's words, the girl hesitated for a moment. She knew that no matter what she did now, Jiang Hai would not change his mind. The only way to stay here is to find a way from the people from the welfare agency. Thinking of this, she nodded, then bowed to Jiang Hai and returned to her room. When she returned to her room, her sister had been waiting for her in the room for a long time. As soon as she saw her sister coming back, she immediately rushed over and began to gesture with her hand language. Unfortunately, she didn't get the information she wanted to know from her sister. Then, she pouted helplessly and sat back on the bed listlessly. They really didn't want to go back to the welfare agency. For them, living there was really similar to staying in prison. Not to mention freedom, it was difficult to even eat and not be bullied. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to escape from there. For them, the only thing they wanted now was to find a warm place where they could eat. Originally, Jiang Hai's place would be as beautiful as heaven, but unfortunately, Jiang Hai didn't seem to let them go. Don't worry, I will find a way. Looking at her sister's sad look, a trace of reluctance flashed in the eyes of the older sister. Although they were born only a few minutes apart, she, as the older sister who came to the world first, must find a way to take care of her younger sister. Then, she began to gesture with her younger sister. You bastard, are you trying to kill me? Also, you said that I'm not divorced. What do you mean? I'm clearly divorced. After the girl left, Jiang Hai couldn't help but punch Moses Adams. He couldn't help but grimace, but he didn't complain or fight back. After all, he still wanted to keep Jiang Hai as a client, and most importantly, he did say something wrong just now. Sir, I just checked your information. You are registered to be married in Huaxia. Moses, Adams said with a grin while rubbing his shoulder. Hearing his words, Jiang Hai frowned. He couldn't figure it out. Sir, you're not an immigrant, but an investment green card. So the immigration office doesn't care if you're married or not. You can fill in whatever you want. Moses, Adams shrugged, probably seeing Jiang Hai's doubts. Obviously, the people in the immigration office wouldn't say no to a client who wanted to invest hundreds of millions of dollars. They wouldn't say no to a client who wanted to invest hundreds of millions of dollars, let alone a non-immigrant. Even if it was a real immigrant, they wouldn't say much. Giving 2 nationalities in exchange for hundreds of millions of dollars of investment, and also solving the problem of more than a dozen jobs. Most importantly, there was nothing more cost-effective than increasing local taxes. King U.S. Empress. Hearing Moses Adams' words, Jiang Hai cursed secretly. At the same time, he thought that he should have been divorced. After all, after the last phone call, he said so harshly, Chile wouldn't tolerate it anymore. But now he wasn't divorced. What was going on? What is Chile going to do? Muttering in a low voice, Jiang Hai walked into the room with a suspicious attitude. As for Moses Adams, he breathed a sigh of relief. Jiang Hai didn't mention his mistake just now, so he escaped. But what does this guy mean? Does he want to keep the 2 girls or not? Looking at Jiang Hai's closed door, Moses Adams touched his chin helplessly, because he really couldn't see through Jiang Hai. In fact, he wasn't the only one who couldn't see through Jiang Hai. Achoo! At this time, in the capital of Huaxia, on the top floor of a commercial office building in the CBD, Chile, who was standing in front of the floor-to-ceiling window and looking at the foggy capital at this time, couldn't help but sneeze. Then she rubbed her nose with some distress, walked to her desk, picked up the mink coat on the back of the chair, and put it on casually. She tightened her clothes, walked to the window again, and looked out of the window where she couldn't see anything. In fact, the prosperity of a country was inseparable from industrial development, and as long as industrial development was inseparable from pollution. At present, China had always been determined to develop a strong national strength, so it was inevitable that they didn't pay too much attention to environmental protection and the like. Jiang Hai still remembered that when he went to the capital when he was young, he could still see the blue sky. In his hometown Ice City, the blue sky was also the main theme of life, but he didn't know when the haze began to become the main theme of this world. It was fine in summer, but in winter after central heating began, it was difficult to see clearly in the northern land beyond 5 meters. It was only when it snowed occasionally that these dirty things could be seen clearly. To be honest, although such an environment caused a lot of trouble for people, the industrial development of a country was always inseparable from these things. What was called developing China? It was a country that had always been developing. What was called a developed country? It was a country that had stopped developing and reached a balance. If it continued to develop, there wouldn't be much effect. Only then would it be called a developed country. A few decades ago, the United States environment was even worse than China's. Sewage flowed everywhere, and the air pollution index was off the charts. But after World War II, they had always been the world's leader. Their development quickly left other countries behind by a few, or even dozens of streets. After they had enough advantages, they began to patiently manage it. The current environment in the United States wasn't as beautiful as a painting, but at least in terms of air quality, it was definitely much better than China's. It couldn't be compared to some deep mountains and forests. Just comparing the air quality in the cities was indeed much better than China's. And in some rural areas, the air quality was even better. Of course, this had nothing to do with Chile at this time. Although she stood in front of the window, she could only vaguely see the outline of some buildings in the distance. She stood here not to look at the scenery, or to get some fresh air, but to think about something. She was thinking about this morning's call from her mother, asking her if she was going back for the new year. After all, it was already the middle of January. There was less than a month left before the new year. Whether she was going back for the new year was naturally the most important thing for every parent. Now Chile's mother was the only one left. If she said that she didn't go back, she would feel uncomfortable in her heart. After all, it was the new year. She also hoped that she could stay at home. But if she wanted to go back, Jiang Hai was destined not to go back with her. How was she going to explain it? Tell the truth or what? But how was she going to say this? It had been half a year since Jiang Hai left the country. In this half a year, she didn't know why, but she had been hiding the news that Jiang Hai was not in the country. But now that the new year was coming, she couldn't hide it anymore. What should she do? This damn guy really knows how to give me problems. Chili slammed the window in front of her hard. But unfortunately, no matter how hard she clenched her teeth, Jiang Hai couldn't hear her. President Qi, are you still going to the banquet tonight? At this moment, the office door opened a crack. Her assistant looked at Chili, who was in a bad mood, and asked carefully. Chili didn't answer. Instead, she turned around and left. Feelings were feelings, career was career. She was no longer the person who needed relationships to survive. Chapter 143. The next morning, Jiang Hai took the girls to the mall and bought them a new set of clothes. Although Jiang Hai was stingy with himself, not that he was stingy, but he really didn't like those upper-class clothes. He was quite generous to others. He bought everyone a new set of clothes, and none of them were cheap. The 15 girls who stayed cost Jiang Hai nearly $20,000, which was equivalent to more than $1,000 per person. This was something that the girls couldn't imagine in the past. As the saying goes, clothes make the man, and saddle makes the horse. You could tell at first glance that the clothes made the man. Although these girls had some congenital defects, when God closed a door for you, He would always open a window for you. Because these girls didn't have enough to eat all year round, and because they lived in a house, they were all quite thin. The fattest girl was no more than 50 kilograms. Their skin was especially white and tender. Most importantly, those men weren't blind. Since they wanted these girls to do that kind of service, they would definitely look for them. Therefore, when these girls changed into new clothes, they were definitely looking for very beautiful girls. Therefore, when these girls changed into new clothes, they were no longer in the same state as they were yesterday. If it weren't for the inferiority complex they had developed over the years, they would have been models on the catwalk if they had a more confident attitude. Looking at these girls, Jiang Hai couldn't help but stare. To be honest, among these girls, some of them didn't lose to Clive in terms of looks. Of course, they didn't win either. Among these girls, the ones that attracted Jiang Hai's attention the most were the twins. After washing up, the two girls were really very beautiful. They had big blue eyes, white skin and golden curly hair. Everything matched the characteristics of blonde beauties. However, they both had small palm-sized faces. Their facial features were delicate and pretty, but they also looked very cute. Especially after changing into the same clothes. Even Jiang Hai was stunned. They were indeed a pair of perfect big lolas. In particular, this pair of big lolas kept looking at Jiang Hai with pitiful eyes. This made Jiang Hai a little unable to stand it. After changing into the clothes, Jiang Hai treated these people to a big meal. After the meal, the welfare institutions that he had contacted had already sent people to pick up the girls under the age of 18. Although these girls were very reluctant, compared to trusting Jiang Hai, perhaps returning to the welfare institution was a good way out. Especially after they learned that the new welfare institution that Jiang Hai found for them was indeed much better than the previous one. They were also a little tempted. And even if they were unhappy in the welfare institution, they still remembered Jiang Hai's words. When they reached adulthood, they could go to Jiang Hai. Jiang Hai would definitely hire them. This was also their way out in the future. After these girls left, 8 of the remaining 10 girls first went to the nearby hospital with Jiang Hai to do a comprehensive physical examination. Since Jiang Hai wanted to hire them, he naturally needed to do a checkup. This was not him being narrow-minded, but he needed to know if his employees' bodies were suitable for employment. After all, they had worked in that kind of work before. Jiang Hai was very afraid that they would carry some untreatable germs. That would be troublesome. Fortunately, these women only had some ordinary trauma diseases in addition to extreme malnutrition and hypoglycemia. The imagined diseases did not exist. Then they went to the lawyer's building of the local welfare institution and signed a labor contract, because the nature of their work was different from that of cowboys and fishermen. They did not have these survival skills, so Jiang Hai only let them do some casual work. Their main job was to plant grapes. When it was time to make wine, they naturally had to pick the grapes. Of course, under normal circumstances, they also needed to take care of the vegetables in the manor. Other miscellaneous work was also given to them. Of course, it was within their capabilities. For example, they regularly cleaned some weeds on the ground or cleaned the parking lot. For these jobs, they were still competent. After all, it did not require much skill, and it was not very tiring. Jiang Hai gave them $400 a week, which was $2,800 a year. Although it was not much, it was at least much less than their previous income. However, they gained dignity here. Most importantly, they did not need to spend anything. Jiang Hai took care of their food and accommodation. If they did not want to work, they could leave at any time. Jiang Hai would not stop them. Most importantly, the money they earned in the past wouldn't be in their hands. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to live in that place and dress like that. Do you think those 13 men are just decorations? Therefore, when they saw such an agreement, the remaining 8 girls quickly signed it. For them, being able to work in Jiang Hai's manor was like a new life for them. The other terms of the contract were similar. The only difference was that the welfare agency would come down to check on them from time to time. They would check to see if Jiang Hai had abused these special girls, or if something had happened that should not have happened. In the eyes of the welfare agency, although Jiang Hai helped them solve the problem of the 8 girls' jobs. But who knew if Jiang Hai had bad intentions? After all, these 8 girls were very beautiful. In this regard, Jiang Hai could only laugh. He had nothing else to say. After the 8 girls had signed the contract, Jiang Hai specifically called Robbins, who was still in the farm, and asked him and Philemon to drive the remaining 2 cars together. Otherwise, they really could not fit so many girls. After finishing the matter, Jiang Hai's 2 F-750 also appeared on the streets of Boston. Although there were many luxury cars on the streets of the United States, the sudden appearance of 3 super pickup trucks still attracted a lot of attention, especially these 10 girls. They originally thought that Jiang Hai's car yesterday was overbearing enough. But today, when they saw the F-750 that was bigger than the F-650, they were shocked again. Some of them carefully climbed into the car. Perhaps they were still afraid of Robbins and Philemon. They did not dare to sit in the front passenger seat, but crowded in the back. Robbins and Philemon were also a little speechless about this. Do they look like bad people? Well, these 2 guys really don't look like good people. There were 6 people in the 2 750s, so there were 4 people left. Naturally, they squeezed into Jiang Hai's car. Fortunately, the car was very wide, and these girls were not fat, so they could still squeeze in. As for Jiang Hai's front passenger seat, the oldest girl among these girls sat there. In any case, they finally got all of them in. Then Jiang Hai, Robbins, and Philemon got up and brought the remaining 10 girls back to his manor. The 2 girls had not found a place yet, so they came back together. Jiang Hai made an appointment that the people from the Welfare Institute would come to pick up the 2 girls tonight. As for whether the 2 girls would leave or not, he really had no idea. As for Moses Adams, after watching Jiang Hai sign the contract with these girls, he left first. As for him, he did not run away, but went to contact the Welfare Institute. Although he was a little uncertain about Jiang Hai's situation. But since Jiang Hai said so, then he needed to do what Jiang Hai said literally. He couldn't really ignore these 2 girls, so he could only bring them back together first. Aphrodite, this is our manor. Not long after, Jiang Hai's motorcade had already seen his manor from afar. Pointing at the huge manor in front of them, Jiang Hai said to the girl beside him. Because he had signed the contract, Jiang Hai also knew the names of these 10 girls. The girl sitting beside him was called Aphrodite Arnold. She was a French girl, 21 years old this year, but was the oldest of these people. When Jiang Hai had asked who would stay, she had been the first to stand up. Although he didn't know her very well, Jiang Hai could tell that she had always been filled with a glimmer of hope for a new life, and Jiang Hai was the catalyst for her hope. It's beautiful. Looking at the snow-white manor in front of her, Aphrodite's big eyes sparkled as she gestured lightly. What's so beautiful about it now? It's all snow. It'll only be beautiful when spring comes. This is a green sea of grass. There's a slender beach road in the middle, and further east is a real ocean. That's what's beautiful. When I first came here, I was also a hothead. They asked for 280 million, so I bought it for 280 million. Now that I think about it, it's really a bit of a loss. Although Jiang Hai didn't know sign language, after a day of contact, he basically knew some things and explained to the girl. Hearing Jiang Hai's words, Aphrodite also laughed silently. At this moment, she looked like a 21-year-old girl. Aphrodite was full of hope for her new life. And among the 3 girls in the back row, only one of them had similar feelings. This girl was called Janice Joy, one of the people signed by Jiang Hai. She just happened to be 18 years old this year. Her skin wasn't particularly white, but was a very healthy wheat color. She had a head of long brown hair and single eyelids, but her eyes weren't small and were slender. She looked especially flirtatious, but her personality was also very naive. At this moment, she was also lying there, looking at the scenery outside. This was where she would be working in the future. As for the remaining twins, they were still thinking about it. However, on this day, Jiang Hai didn't completely gain nothing from them. At least he knew their names. The older sister was called Daliana Evelyn, and the younger sister was called Marian Evelyn. Through the understanding of the association, this pair of sisters were the only girls who had been abused in the orphanage. When they were 12 years old, the 2 sisters escaped from the orphanage and were later found by one of the 13 men. Originally, after a few years of recuperation, they would come out to work like the others. However, in order to not let her sister get hurt, Daliana learned how to steal. Every day, she stole some money to exchange for food. Just like that, 2 years passed. Chapter 144. Because there are indeed a lot of you, and I have to leave 2 rooms for the winemaker, you can only squeeze in for the time being. Jiang Hai returned to his manor with the girls. After parking the car, he took them into the residential area. Of course, when they walked in, they attracted the attention of the people in the manor. After all, they were young and beautiful. It would be strange if the men did not look at them. The fishermen and Philemon were fine, since they had families. If they looked at them too much, they would be punished. Robbins, Burkdaler, and Edward Anderson were old, so they just looked at them. However, Belle and Harriman were somewhat stunned. Even when the girls got off the car, the 2 of them took the initiative to help the girls carry the toiletries that Jiang Hai bought for them. This action startled the girls. They were still very vigilant towards others, so they didn't want Harriman and Belle to touch their things. They would rather carry it themselves. Zhao Hai nodded and said, all right. Harriman and Belle were very hurt by this. Now, the only person these girls could trust was probably Jiang Hai. Although Jiang Hai did not show it on his face, he was actually very happy. After driving away Harriman and Belle, who wanted to flatter him, Jiang Hai took them to the back of the villa area. Then Jiang Hai arranged for them to live in 4 small villas in the residential area. There were 16 small villas in Jiang Hai's residential area, which were divided into 3 rows. The first row was Jiang Hai's big villa. Then, with Jiang Hai's villa as the starting point, there were 5 small villas in a row. The right side was directly connected to the cowshed. In the middle of each small villa, there was a space to ensure their private world. Then there were 5 villas in the second row, and 6 villas in the third row. Now 10 rooms were occupied. Robbins, Burkdaler, Philemon Turner, Harriman Fells, and Belle Lester. Each of them lived in a room in the first row. After all, they were the ones who chose the rooms first. The fishermen recruited by Jiang Hai, led by Edward Anderson, lived in the villas in the second row. Jiang Hai arranged 2 villas for the new girls, who lived in the third row. Originally, Jiang Hai didn't need so many people. After all, if it was replaced by some normal men, just taking care of the grapes, planting vegetables, doing odd jobs, and so on, for people wouldn't be enough. But who told him to pity these girls? It's not crowded. Thank you. After hearing Jiang Hai's arrangement, Aphrodite and the others, who were originally standing behind Jiang Hai, immediately gestured. These villas all had more than 2 rooms. Not to mention individual rooms, even one room was excellent. They had been looking at Jiang Hai's villas just now. To be honest, Jiang Hai's villas were not worse than the villas in the suburbs where the rich lived in the Boston area. Even if they were not as rich as the rich, it would not be a problem for them to be comparable to ordinary white-collar workers. Because when Jiang Hai was decorating these small villas, he bought all the things that he needed to buy. The house had lights, beds, wardrobes, geothermal heat, electrical appliances, and so on. Although it could not be compared to Jiang Hai's main villa, it was still very luxurious and comfortable. Jiang Hai had already told them to turn on the geothermal heat in advance. Therefore, when the girls entered the small villa, the temperature had already reached 26 degrees Celsius. It was a very comfortable temperature, at least in the eyes of these girls. You don't have to be too polite with me. After all, you have to work here. If you have any problems in the future, you can come to my main villa to find me at any time. If you encounter any danger, there's a phone in the house. If it's not convenient for you, just press the button. Remember to lock the door. Although the people in my manor should be good people, you must be vigilant. Looking at the nervous girls in front of him, Jiang Hai smiled and said, then continued to introduce them to each other. By the way, can you cook? Don't starve yourselves. After thinking for a while, Jiang Hai suddenly asked the girls. Their identities were indeed a little special. It might not be good for them to eat in other people's houses. After all, they were different from him. And he did not have a professional cook here. If they did not know how to cook, it would be troublesome. No need, we all know how to cook. Hearing Jiang Hai's words, Aphrodite gestured. After all, they used to live in the orphanage, and the children in the orphanage, except for the very young ones, would be arranged to do some work when they grew a little older. For example, it was very normal for them to help in the kitchen. Therefore, their cooking skills were different. However, they would not starve to death. Seeing that they all knew how to cook, Jiang Hai was relieved. Then he brought these girls to his house. Here, Jiang Hai introduced the pets that the girls gave him. In fact, they were mainly Little White and Little Yellow. This was to prevent the two from accidentally injuring them. When the girls saw the two pets, they were very scared, especially Delina and Marion. They had dealt with these dogs a lot in the past. After all, where they lived, there were a lot of stray dogs. And these stray dogs were a threat to these people for a long time. However, these two dogs were different from those ferocious dogs that would bare their teeth when they saw them. They were very obedient. When Jiang Hai was talking, they just sat there obediently and looked at the girls in front of them with their big eyes. After Jiang Hai's voice fell, they sniffed the girls and then left. After the two dogs left, the girls couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief. Although they didn't know why, the two dogs gave them too much pressure. Seeing the girls relaxed, Jiang Hai didn't say much. This was also a test, a show of strength. But now it seems that the effect was good. Then, Jiang Hai brought them to the warehouse. When Jiang Hai opened the warehouse, the girls were shocked. In Jiang Hai's cold storage, there was a lot of meat hanging. These were the meat that Luo Binsi and the others wanted to eat, because their consumption was really high, especially after the 5 fishermen joined. So every time they killed a cow, Luo Binsi and the others would give the best beef to Jiang Hai. The rest of the beef would be put in the cold storage. Whoever needs to eat it can come and get it, it's convenient. Jiang Hai's house had 3 cold storage, one for frozen meat, one for frozen fish, shrimp and crabs, and one for storing vegetables. Of course, Jiang Hai also had a small warehouse in his villa, which was used to store the good things he liked to eat. In front of the surprised eyes of these girls, Jiang Hai opened the 3 warehouses. Seeing this, the girls' eyes widened even more. As long as you don't waste anything, you can eat as much as you want. As long as you can eat it, you can take it back to eat. You can choose to come and take some every day, or take more back. The place where you live also has a refrigerator, but the frozen food is not very delicious. Looking at the performance of the girls, Jiang Hai smiled. The expressions of these girls made him very satisfied. Hearing Jiang Hai's words, the girls also calmed down. Before coming here, they had already arranged who would live with whom according to their close relationship. At this time, they also sent representatives of each family and walked into the cold storage. Compared to vegetables and seafood, they now prefer to eat meat. After all, the Boston area is close to the sea. The fishing here is abundant all year round, and the price of seafood is not high. As for vegetables, Although the vegetables in the United States are also very expensive, the people in the United States don't eat this kind of thing. Compared to other foods, they prefer beef. At most, after taking a lot of beef, they take some vegetables to season it. Jiang Hai watched them take all the food and sent them back to the room where they lived. It's still winter in the next 2 months, so there's no way to grow grapes or vegetables. You should take care of your bodies first. You are too thin now. I want to raise some laborers, not models. Wait until March, when the harvest will start. When Jiang Hai left, the girls breathed a sigh of relief. Then, a happy smile appeared on their faces again. Although they had imagined what kind of place Jiang Hai's place would be, they didn't expect it. But they really didn't think that Jiang Hai's place would be so good. There was a warm, comfortable, spacious villa to live in, good beef, fish, shrimp, vegetables to eat, TV to watch, and even their own private space to receive a weekly salary. They didn't have to worry about anything. They didn't have to starve. Compared to where they used to live, this was heaven. After Jiang Hai left, the girls began to get busy. They checked their rooms, every brick, every tile, even the water meter, gas meter, and electricity meter. They carefully looked at it for a long time before they started to cook. Although the cooking wasn't delicious for them, it was the best delicacy. They were full for the first time in many years. Lying on the big bed in the bedroom, many of them fell asleep as soon as they touched the pillow, even though the sun hadn't completely set at this time. As for the leader chosen by the girls, Aphrodite Arnold didn't fall asleep. Instead, she lay on the bed, blinking her big eyes and looking at the white ceiling above her. At this moment, her heart was filled with Jiang Hai. This man had rescued her from that dark world. Towards Jiang Hai, 90% of her heart was filled with gratitude, and the other 10% had some special feelings. At this moment, Jiang Hai didn't know about this. After settling the 8 girls down, Jiang Hai returned to the villa. Looking at the 2 girls in front of him, who had yet to find a way out, Jiang Hai couldn't help but smack his teeth. I hope the people from the Welfare Institute will be able to persuade them. Chapter 145. You're here. Please come in. It turned out that whether it was at home or abroad, the effect of government agencies could be improved. Even with Moses Adams's face, 2 staff members from the Boston area's welfare agency came to Jiang Hai's manor when the sky was already a little dark. Under the guidance of Moses Adams, they came to the door of Jiang Hai's villa. After parking the car, a man and a woman got out of the car. Both of them were white. The girl looked like she was in her late 20s. She was very beautiful, but she was not particularly young. The wrinkles next to her nose were deep. She had white skin and brown hair. She looked very American. There was also a man who looked to be in his 30s. He was white. To be exact, in the Boston area, there were not many people of color, because in the earliest days, this place was actually a disaster area for racial discrimination. But later, because this was also a metropolitan area and the academic center of the United States, under the intervention of the American government, this place became a key area to rectify discrimination. Today, although the majority of white people in the Boston area were of Irish descent, the discrimination against people of color was gradually disappearing. Except for some old people who still maintained their original views, people in their 30s and 40s had restrained their character. But obviously, this guy didn't seem to belong to this group, because when he saw Jiang Hai, he couldn't help but frown. Originally, he thought that since this manor was so big, the owner here would probably be a kind old white man. But he didn't expect it to be a yellow young man. This made him reduce Jiang Hai's score in his heart. Jiang Hai didn't care about this. They could see him as they liked, but they couldn't show it. Jiang Hai was quite a narrow-minded person. If these guys dared to show off in front of him, he would not let them go easily. Hello, my name is Kelly Marie. This is my colleague Carlos Barron. We are here to pick up the girls. Hearing Jiang Hai's words, the woman couldn't help but smile and greet him. The man nodded, and then entered the room under Jiang Hai's signal. As soon as they entered the room, they saw the Evelyn sisters sitting on the sofa watching TV. When the sisters saw the 2 strangers coming in, they instantly became alert. Hello, my name is Kelly. You can call me Big Sister Kelly. I'm here to pick you up. Seeing the vigilance in the eyes of the two girls, the woman gestured as she walked in front of the two girls and looked at them. Unfortunately, even though she had a smile on her face, the two girls tried their best to shrink back, unwilling to get close to her. Seeing the vigilant look of the two girls, the woman also sighed. It seemed that it was not going to be easy. You don't have to be afraid. I don't mean any harm. You can't always stay in someone else's house. You will disturb him. Looking at the two girls, the woman continued to gesture. No, we won't leave. We want to stay here. We can work in exchange for food. Seeing the woman's gesture, the elder sister Daliana Evelyn's immediately followed. No, you can't. You are still too young. If he hires you, it will actually harm him. Do you understand? But before she finished her gesture, the woman had already interrupted her and said to them with a serious face. But after hearing her words, the two girls were still unmoved. They just shrank back, shook their heads and waved their hands. They were unwilling to leave no matter what. The woman continued to persuade them, but the two girls were determined. Jiang Hai and the others stood there for half an hour. During this time, the woman tried to persuade them, but it was to no avail. The two girls were determined not to go with them. At this time, the man who was standing behind them couldn't bear it anymore. He walked in front of the woman and reached out to grab the two girls. At the same time he said, Sister, you're not going to go with me. At the same time he said, Don't talk nonsense with them. Just take them away. These two girls are determined to stay here. You can't persuade them to leave. When his voice fell, the man had already grabbed the two girls' arms. The woman beside him, Kelly, was hesitating whether she should do this or not. But judging from the current situation, it seemed that she didn't have much choice. If they didn't take them away by force, they would probably return empty-handed today. These two girls had been malnourished for many years. Their bodies were so thin that they were almost like a layer of skin wrapped around bones. Being pulled off the sofa by this man, the younger sister, Marian Eveline, was almost scared out of her wits. She just struggled hard and didn't want to be pulled away by this man. On the other side, her elder sister, Daliana Eveline, was struggling hard. She even forcefully hit this man's arm. However, it was a pity that her strength wasn't enough to move this man. Seeing this guy's rude actions, Jiang Hai subconsciously became angry. He stepped forward to stop this scene, but just as he took a step forward, he was stopped by Moses, Adams beside him. If you don't want them to stay, then you can only watch them leave. Moses, Adams looked at Jiang Hai and said seriously. After all, at this moment, this man just pulled and didn't do anything else. If Jiang Hai made a sound now, it would be really troublesome. Hearing his words, Jiang Hai couldn't help but stop. His eyes were a bit hesitant. He was born to be indecisive and didn't have his own opinion. Of course, once he decided on something, he would follow it to the end. But now for him, these two girls were really troublesome. Moreover, he was not qualified to deal with them. Ah, stinky girl, how dare you bite me? While Jiang Hai was hesitating, Daliana had already rushed to the man's side. She knew that it was impossible for her to beat this man or pull off his hand with her own strength. Therefore, she used her strongest weapon, her mouth, to bite this man's arm. Under the pain, the man couldn't help loosening his grip on the two sisters. Looking at the blood on his arm, this man was also furious. Looking at Daliana, who was still stubbornly raising her head in front of him, this man didn't think too much. He raised his right hand and slapped towards Daliana's face. Looking at the approaching slap, Daliana was startled. She immediately closed her eyes and shrunk her head into her body. However, even so, she didn't step back. Instead, she still stood there tenaciously to show her determination. The slap brought along a gust of wind towards her face, but after the gust of wind passed, she didn't feel any pain even after waiting for a long time. Daliana couldn't help but feel a little strange. When she opened her eyes, she discovered that the slap had stopped less than 5 centimeters away from her. The slap was still the same one, but on the man's wrist, there was a hand that wasn't very big, but firmly grasped there. The huge force caused the man's hand to continuously tremble, and his face was also flushed red from suffocation. Needless to say, the owner of this hand was obvious. The only person here who had the ability to block this attack was Jiang Hai. Is this how you deal with these kids? Looking at this man in front of him, Jiang Hai's voice was a bit cold. If it weren't for him today, this kid would have been beaten up. Looking at the two girls who were curled up like kittens in front of him, Jiang Hai's heart was burning with anger. F***ck off, yellow. Yellow man, you're not a good person either. Since you've decided to send them to the welfare organization, they have nothing to do with you. Don't think that I don't know what you're planning to do by hiring so many deaf and mute girls. Hearing Jiang Hai's words, the man grinned and roared angrily. But fortunately, after he said the word yellow, he took back his words. Otherwise, Jiang Hai would have directly made him unable to speak the rest of his words. But now what he said shocked Jiang Hai. In all honesty, when he brought these girls here, he really didn't have the slightest bit of dirty thoughts. He just pitied these girls and wanted to find a way out for them. However, this guy's words made Jiang Hai quite unhappy. At that time, Jiang Hai's hand gradually increased in strength. At the same time, Jiang Hai tried to break the guy's hand. But this guy couldn't break free from Jiang Hai's grip. Jiang Hai's expression changed. The huge pain made him a little confused. At that time, he kicked Jiang Hai without thinking, but Jiang Hai was faster. He kicked back and the man's leg was crooked. Then, the huge pain and the soreness in his leg made him kneel on the ground. Looking at Jiang Hai's murderous gaze, he had no other choice but to scream. Please stop. Mr. Jiang, calm down. Seeing this scene, Kelly and Moses Adams on the other side immediately shouted at Jiang Hai. Hearing their words, Jiang Hai's original anger gradually subsided. When he let go of his hand, he kicked out. It happened to kick this guy in the chest and sent him flying. Fortunately, Jiang Hai didn't use all his strength, but the kick still made the man vomit on the ground for a long time. Mister, don't you think you went a little overboard? The woman immediately ran over and checked her colleague's injuries. Although he didn't suffer any internal injuries and didn't have any broken bones, it was obvious that Jiang Hai had taught him a lesson, especially his right hand. At this time, Jiang Hai had pinched his wrist until it was purple and black. She estimated that it would take at least 10 days to half a month to recover. Although there was no fatal injury, it still made the woman very angry. She stood up and said to Jiang Hai, "Overboard? Why didn't you say anything when he was about to hit them? Or are you used to treating these girls like this?" Hearing the woman's words, Jiang Hai raised his eyebrows and shouted at the woman. Chapter 146. Carlos is just in a hurry to take them away. Besides, isn't this the result you want? Hearing Jiang Hai's words, the woman couldn't help but be speechless. But never used the word reason to measure a woman's mind. Obviously, at this time, she couldn't win against Jiang Hai by talking about the previous topic, so she wisely chose another topic. I don't want to talk to you anymore. These two girls won't leave. Hearing the woman's words, Jiang Hai snorted coldly, then turned his head and looked at the two girls who were as pitiful as injured kittens, but still stubbornly raised their heads. Jiang Hai originally wanted to send them away, but unconsciously, he gave up the idea. If it really doesn't work, I'll take them in. Although he also felt that it was a little inconvenient, it was better to stay with him than to let them be bullied outside. At least he wouldn't have any bad thoughts about them. I will contact your welfare agency. Please go ahead. Hearing that Jiang Hai had made up his mind to adopt these two girls, Moses Adams shrugged. Although he felt that Jiang Hai was taking off his pants to fart and wasting his time. But since it was Jiang Hai's decision, then as a lawyer, he had to clean up after Jiang Hai. This was his job. After hearing Moses Adams say this, the two people from the welfare agency looked at each other and finally turned to leave. Hearing the sound of the two people driving away, Jiang Hai sighed. He couldn't take care of himself. Now there were two more burdens. Looking at the two little girls standing in front of him, Jiang Hai smiled bitterly. You guys, you win. Come and eat with me. Jiang Hai nodded the heads of the two girls. Perhaps they knew that Jiang Hai wasn't going to drive them away again. The corners of the two girls' mouths couldn't help but grin. Their two big eyes were smiling like crescent moons, which was particularly cute. Jiang Hai didn't know whether it was right or wrong to take them in, but the most important thing was that this was his heart. After hearing Jiang Hai's words, the two girls knew that since Jiang Hai said that he wanted to keep them, he wouldn't lie to them. So they went back, picked up the coats that Jiang Hai bought for them, and put them on again. Just now, Jiang Hai said that he would go to Mrs. Philomen's place to eat every day. Since they were going to live here in the future, there would probably be 2 more people coming over to eat. However, they also thought that this was what they should do, since Jiang Hai had decided to let them stay. Then in the future, the problem of eating Jiang Hai's meals, cleaning the house, washing clothes, and even warming the bed would naturally be their job. Now, the first thing they had to do was to learn how to cook as soon as possible. Jiang Hai didn't know what these 2 little girls were thinking about. After putting on the coats, Moses Adams also came back. After informing Jiang Hai, he didn't follow Jiang Hai to eat. Instead, he went back first. Tomorrow he would go to help Jiang Hai with the adoption documents and so on. These things naturally had to be done by him as a lawyer. As for why he didn't eat, Jiang Hai didn't ask him to stay. Instead, he sent $1,000 to his account. This was also the fee for his hard work today. The other lawyers' fees were calculated separately. This was to make up for his meal. After receiving the text message, Moses Adams didn't refuse. After all, he was helping Jiang Hai mainly for the money. There was no need for him to refuse the boss's money. If you want a horse to run, you have to feed it. Jiang Hai knew this very well. After Moses Adams left, Jiang Hai took the 2 girls to Mrs. Philomen's house. When Mrs. Philomen came back, she didn't go to the cowshed. She was still watching TV in the living room. Seeing Jiang Hai bring the 2 girls over, she was a little surprised. "Boss, didn't you say you would send them to the orphanage?" When they were in Boston, Philomen had asked what to do with the girls after they were sent back to the manor. The 8 girls were already adults, so they could be hired as employees. These girls came from poor backgrounds. Now that they had the opportunity to live a stable life, they would probably be good employees. However, these 2 girls couldn't be. In the United States, it was illegal to hire child labor and illegal labor. Among them, illegal labor wasn't a big deal, but child labor wasn't a small matter. Therefore, Philomen was a little uncertain about Jiang Hai's thoughts regarding these 2 girls. Just now the people from the orphanage came. They were really rude, and even wanted to beat them. Although I know that this kind of thing is inevitable everywhere, but so I decided to adopt them. Anyway, my place is very big, and I don't have anyone to talk to. They can accompany me here. I also need to find a school for them. Sitting next to Philomen, Jiang Hai rubbed his temples in distress. Looking at the 2 beautiful sisters standing next to him, he really didn't know what to say. "Boss, sometimes your heart is too kind. But this is also good. With a kind boss, our lives will be much better." Philomen laughed after hearing Jiang Hai's words. "Mrs. Turner, I'll have to trouble you to cook for 2 more people in the future. Do you want me to give you a raise?" At this moment, Mrs. Philomen, who had been busy, came out of the kitchen. Looking at the tanned and plump woman, Jiang Hai said with a smile, "What raise? The money you give me is to cook 3 meals a day. In the end, you don't eat at my place for at least 2 meals a day. I originally wanted to ask you to lower my salary, but now, I have a job again." Mrs. Philomen laughed heartily after hearing Jiang Hai's words. She walked to the fridge next to her, and prepared to get some food. After hearing Mrs. Philomen's words, the 2 girls who had been standing next to her exchanged glances with each other. Then, they quickly walked to the fridge, and helped Mrs. Philomen pick up the food. Mrs. Philomen originally didn't want them to work. After all, if Jiang Hai helped them, then at least in name, they would be Jiang Hai's daughters. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that they were their own little bosses. How could they let their boss work for them? But when she saw the desire in the eyes of the 2 girls, she couldn't help but be taken aback. Then, she took out the beef in her hand and handed it to the 2 girls. She knew that the 2 girls wanted to show off and prove that they weren't completely useless. To be honest, Mrs. Philomen's thoughts toward the 8 women were complicated. She felt pity, puzzlement, and vigilance. The people of the United States, or to be exact, the people of Europe and America, were basically like this. They weren't willing to interfere with the lives of others, regardless of whether they were living well or not. It would make people feel that they were somewhat cold-blooded. But this was their life policy and way of dealing with people. Perhaps when they saw something that moved them, or made them feel pity, they would give some monetary help. But other than money, they wouldn't give anything else. For example, they wouldn't casually let stray cats and dogs into their rooms, nor would they take in homeless people on the street. It was not that they were cold-blooded. After all, no one was willing to change their lives because of some trivial matters. Even in China, there were many such people. As the old saying went, when the father dies and the mother marries, everyone takes care of themselves. How could there be so much kindness? This was the origin of their pity and confusion. They couldn't understand why Jiang Hai brought them back. Based on their understanding of Jiang Hai, he didn't seem to have the intention of keeping the 8 girls at home. As for their vigilance, it was because they had also heard about the origin of these women. They didn't have proper jobs in the past. Although their backgrounds were somewhat pitiful, they were still employed in that kind of profession. It was already good enough that ordinary housewives didn't look at them with hostility. But it could be foreseen that these women would look at their husbands with unprecedented intensity. However, such complicated thoughts were mainly directed toward the 8 women. Daliana and Marian were obviously not among them. Mrs. Philemon was quite fond of the 2 girls, so she brought them into the kitchen. Seeing this scene, although Jiang Hai wanted to say something, he didn't. This was because he didn't know how he felt about the 2 girls. Now he felt pity for them. But when he thought about living with them in the future, Jiang Hai, after waiting for a long time, a very Boston-style dinner began. Although Daliana and Marian ate well yesterday and today, their hearts were actually hanging in the air because they didn't want to go back to the orphanage. And Jiang Hai insisted on sending them back, which made them very afraid. So they didn't eat properly during the meal. This time, the 2 girls were finally relieved, and they ate freely. Jiang Hai was stunned when he saw this. Thinking about it, they hadn't eaten such delicious beef, fish, and soup for a long time. If it weren't for the fact that he was afraid that they would eat too much, Jiang Hai estimated that they could eat for the whole night. After eating, although the 2 girls were full, they still stood up and helped Mrs. Philemon clean up the dishes. After everything was done, Jiang Hai took them back to his villa. Jiang Hai's villa was very large. Usually there were only 5 living creatures in it: Jiang Hai, Goldie, Xiaobai, Daiteeth, and Chirps. Chirps had been captured for a long time, but it hadn't grown up yet. Although it didn't look like a bald chicken, its range of activity was still limited to Jiang Hai's room. As for Daiteeth, Goldie, and Xiaobai, they were running around. When Jiang Hai came back with the 2 girls, the 3 little guys also greeted them. They also had an impression of the 2 little girls, but although they were enthusiastic, the 2 girls had a natural fear of dogs. Okay, you guys go play by yourselves. Don't scare them. They will be our family in the future. After kicking the 2 dogs' butts, Jiang Hai chased them aside and said with a smile. The 2 dogs heard Jiang Hai's words and looked at each other. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.